Chapter 12, Part 2 of His Excellency Eugene Rougon by Émile Zola, translated by Ernest Alfred Visitelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 12, Part 2. While Madame Coureur was speaking, Monsieur Bejoin, in his turn, had begun to show signs of excitement, and he now stammered, "I am exactly in the same position as Madame. I've never asked Rougon for anything. Never, never. Anything that he may have done has been done in spite of me, and without my knowing anything about it. He avails himself of one's silence to take every advantage of one. Yes, every advantage." His words died away in a mutter, and then all four remained for a moment silently wagging their heads. Presently, Monsieur Kahn resumed in a solemn voice. "The truth of the matter is this. Rougon is an ungrateful fellow. You all remember how we used to scour Paris, working to get him back into office. We devoted ourselves to his cause to such a point as to take our meals anywhere and anyhow, and he then contracted a debt towards us which in his whole lifetime he could not fairly discharge. Now, however, he finds gratitude too heavy a burden for him, and so he casts us adrift. Well, we might have expected as much." Yes, indeed," cried the others. "He owes everything to us, and he's repaying us in a pretty fashion." Then for a while they completely overwhelmed Rougon with an enumeration of all the things they had done for him. Whenever one of them became silent, another brought forward some still more crushing detail. The colonel, however, suddenly felt uneasy about Auguste, who had disappeared from the bedchamber. Just then a peculiar noise was heard in the dressing-room, a sort of gentle, continuous dabbling sound, and the colonel hurried off to see what it could be. He then found Auguste apparently much interested in the bath, which Antonia had forgotten to empty. Some slices of lemon, which Clorinde had used for her nails, were floating on the water, and these Auguste was inquisitively examining. "The boy is quite a nuisance," murmured Clorinde. "He goes poking about everywhere." "Really now," said Madame Coureur, who seemed to have been waiting for the colonel's absence, "the thing in which Rougon is most deficient is tact. Between ourselves, I may say, now that the gallant colonel can't hear us, that it was a great mistake on Rougon's part to take that young man into his office in defiance of the regulations. That is not the kind of service a man ought to render to his friends. It only brings him into discredit." However, Clorinde interrupted her. "Do go, my dear madame," said she, "and see what they're doing in the bathroom." Monsieur Kahn had begun to smile, and when Madame Coureur left the room, he also lowered his voice and put in a word. "How fine it is to hear her talk," he said. "The colonel has, no doubt, been well looked after by Rougon, but she herself has no reason to complain. Rougon absolutely compromised himself on her account in that troublesome Martineau business. He showed himself very deficient in morality in that matter. Nobody ought to kill a man for the mere sake of pleasing an old friend, ought he?" Then Monsieur Kahn got up and began to stroll about the room, and ultimately he went back to the anteroom to get his cigar case, which he'd left in his overcoat. At that moment the colonel and Madame Coureur came back. "Hello, has Kahn gone?" exclaimed the colonel, and without any transition he went on. "Well, we others may have a right to run down Rougon, but Kahn, in my opinion, ought to remain dumb. I don't like heartless people. Just now I kept from saying anything, but in a cafe where I was this afternoon, it was openly said that Rougon was falling through having lent his name to that swindling railway line from Niort to Angers. A man ought not to make such a blunder as that. To think of that big fat imbecile firing mines and delivering speeches a mile long and even trying to make the Emperor responsible for the success of the line. It's Kahn, my good friends, who's made a mess of it all for all of us. Don't you agree with me, Bejoin?" Monsieur Bejoin briskly nodded his head. He had already agreed with Madame Coureur and Monsieur Kahn. Meanwhile, Clorinde, still reclining on the couch, was amusing herself with biting the tassel of her girdle, which she kept drawing over her face as though she wanted to tickle herself. Her eyes were wide open and smiling at the ceiling. "Hush!" she said, all at once. Monsieur Kahn was just coming back, biting off the end of a cigar between his teeth. He lighted it and blew out 2 or 3 big puffs of smoke, for smoking was allowed in Clorinde's bedroom. Then, resuming the previous conversation, he said, "Well, if Rougon asserts that he has weakened his power by serving us, I can truthfully declare that we have been dreadfully compromised by his patronage. He has such a rough, brutal way of pushing one forward that it's no wonder if one breaks one's nose against the wall. However, as a result of all these violent ways of his, he's now tumbling down again. For my part, I feel no desire to help to pick him up any more. If a man can't preserve his own credit, there must be something wrong with him. I tell you that he is seriously compromising us. I have got heavy enough responsibilities as it is, and I give him up." While saying this, however, Monsieur Kahn spoke hesitatingly, and his voice grew faint. Madame Coqueur and the colonel bent their heads to escape the necessity of declaring themselves in the same peremptory fashion. In spite of everything, Rougon was still in office, and before abandoning him, they wanted to secure some other powerful patron. "The fat man isn't everybody," said Clorinde carelessly. At this, they all looked at her, hoping that she was going to give them some formal promise. But she made a little gesture as though to bid them have patience. This tacit hint of some new patronage which would shower benefits upon them was really the mainspring of their assiduous attendance at the young woman's Sundays and Thursdays. Among the strong odors of her room they scented a coming triumph, and, believing that they had exhausted Rougon in obtaining the satisfaction of their early desires, they looked forward to the advent of some new power that should realize their more recent dreams, which were far greater and more numerous than the others had been. However, Clorinde at last raised herself up from her pillows, and, bending towards Pozzo, she blew into his neck, laughing loudly as she did so, as though thrilled with some wild impulse of merriment. When she felt pleased, she often gave way to some such outburst of childish gaiety. Pozzo, whose hands seemed to have gone to sleep on his guitar, threw back his picturesque Italian head and showed his white teeth when he was thus roused. But Clorinde went on laughing and blowing with such force that at last he begged for mercy. Then, when she'd scolded him in Italian, she turned towards Madame Coqueur. "He must sing to us, mustn't he?" she said. "If he will sing, I won't blow any more. He's composed a very pretty song. You will like it." They all asked to hear the song, and Pozzo began to finger his guitar again. Then he sang, keeping his eyes fixed upon Clorinde all the time. The song was like a passionate murmur accompanied by short, soft notes. The tremulous Italian words could not be distinguished, however. At the last couplet, which seemed to be expressive of the pains of love, Pozzo, while assuming a very mournful tone, began to smile with an expression of mingled joy and despair. When he finished, his audience enthusiastically applauded him. Why didn't he publish those charming songs of his, they asked. Surely his position in the diplomatic service could be no impediment. "I once knew a captain who brought out a comic opera," said Colonel Jobelin, "and nobody in the regiment thought any the worse of him for it." "Ah, but in the diplomatic service," murmured Madame Coqueur, shaking her head. "Oh, I think you are wrong there," remarked Monsieur Kahn. "Diplomatists are like other men, and many of them cultivate the social arts." However, Clorinde touched Pozzo lightly with her foot and whispered something to him, and thereupon the young man rose, laid his guitar on a heap of clothes, and left the room. When he returned some 5 minutes afterwards, he was followed by Antonia, carrying a tray on which were a water bottle and some glasses. Pozzo himself held a sugar basin, for which there was no room on the tray. Nothing stronger than sugared water was ever drunk at Clorine's receptions, and her friends knew that she was well pleased if they simply took the water by itself. "Hallo, what's that?" she suddenly exclaimed, turning towards the dressing-room, where a door could be heard creaking. Then, as though remembering, she added, "Oh, it's my mother. She's been in bed." It was indeed Countess Dalbi, who made her appearance in a black woolen dressing-gown with a piece of lace tied round her head. Flaminio, the big footman with the long beard and brigand's face, was supporting her from behind, almost carrying her, in fact, in his arms. However, she did not appear to have aged. Her pale face still smiled, with the smile of one who had been a queen of beauty. "Wait a moment, mother," exclaimed Clorinde. "I'll give you this couch. I'll lie down on the bed. I'm not feeling very well. I've got an insect inside me, and it's begun to bite me again." There was a general movement. Pozzo and Madame Carreur assisted the young woman to her bed. They had to turn down the coverings and flatten the pillows. Countess Dalbi, meantime, lay down on the couch, while Flaminio remained standing behind her, black and silent, though glaring ferociously at the visitors. "You don't mind my lying down, do you?" said Clorinde to the others. "I feel so much better when I'm lying down. I'm not going to send you away. You must stay where you are." She was stretched out at full length, her elbow resting on a pillow, while her spreading black blouse looked like a stream of ink upon the white counterpane. Nobody had had any idea of going away. Madame Carreur was talking in a whisper to Pozzo about Clorinde's superb figure, while Monsieur Kahn, Monsieur Bejoin, and the Colonel paid their respects to the Countess, who nodded her head and smiled. Every now and then, without turning round, she would call in a soft voice, "Flaminio." The tall footman knew what she meant, and at once raised a cushion, or brought a stool, or took a scent bottle from his pocket, retaining, however, in all he did, the ferocious air of a brigand in evening dress. All at once, Auguste happened to have an accident. After prowling through the 3 rooms, stopping to examine all the garments that were lying about, he had felt a little bored, and to amuse himself had begun to drink glassful after glassful of sugared water. Clorinde kept her eyes upon him, watching the sugar basin gradually empty, when suddenly the youth broke his glass, against the side of which he'd been pressing his spoon too violently. "It's all because he puts too much sugar in," cried Clorinde. "Dunderhead!" exclaimed the Colonel. "You can't even drink water rationally. 1 big glassful every morning and every evening. That's the way. There's nothing better. It keeps away all diseases." Fortunately, there was a diversion, for Monsieur Bouchard now made his appearance. It was past 10 o'clock. He had dined in town, which had caused him to be a little late. He seemed surprised at not finding his wife there. "Monsieur d'Escorval said he would bring her," he remarked, "and I promised to call for her and take her home." Half an hour later, Madame Bouchard at length arrived, accompanied by Monsieur d'Escorval and Monsieur Larouquette. After a coolness which had lasted a year, the young Marquis had returned to his allegiance to the pretty blonde. He and she, it appeared, had met Monsieur Larouquette as they were driving in an open cab to the Delestangs, and thereupon they had all 3 gone on to the Bois together, laughing loudly and indulging in somewhat broad pleasantries. Indeed, Monsieur d'Escorval had even fancied for a moment that the deputy's arm was behind Madame Bouchard's waist. The trio brought a whiff of gaiety into Clorinde's room, something of the fresh air of the dark avenues of the Bois, along which they had just passed so merrily. "Yes, we've been to the lake," said Monsieur Larouquette. "They insisted upon taking me off. I was quietly going home to work." Then he suddenly became serious. During the previous session he'd made a speech upon a financial question, after a whole month's special study of his subject, and since then he had affected a very steady-going air, as though he had buried all his youthful frivolities. "By the way," began Kahn, taking him to the end of the room, "you who are on such good terms with Marcy." Then he continued in such a low tone that nothing further could be heard. "Pretty Madame Bouchard, who had bowed to the Countess, was now sitting beside the bed, holding Clorinde's hand and sympathizing with her in a fluty voice. Meantime, Monsieur Bouchard, who remained standing in a prim and dignified attitude, suddenly began to speak aloud amidst all the surrounding buzz of conversation. "I have something to tell you," he said. "Our fat man is a nice sort of fellow." Before explaining himself, however, he began to rail at Rougon as the others had done. It was now impossible, he said, to ask him for anything, for he could not even return a polite answer, and he, Monsieur Bouchard, considered that politeness came before everything. Then, as they continued to ask him what Rougon had done, he at last told them. "I can't bear injustice," said he. "I spoke to him about one of the clerks in my division, Georges Duchesne. You know him, don't you? You've met him at my house. Well, he's a young fellow of sterling merit, and we treat him as though he were our own son. My wife is very fond of him, and he comes from the same part of the country as herself. Well, we had lately been scheming to get Duchesne appointed assistant head clerk. It was my idea, but you approved of it, didn't you, Adèle?" Madame Bouchard looked embarrassed, and bent yet more closely to Clorinde to escape the eyes of Monsieur d'Escaraille, which she felt were fixed on her. "Well," continued the head of department, "how do you think the fat man received my request? He glared at me in his offensive way for a full minute, and then he bluntly refused to make the appointment. When I pressed the matter, he said to me with a smile, 'Monsieur Bouchard, don't press your request. You distress me. There are very grave reasons why I can't accede to it.' I couldn't get him to say another word. He saw, however, that I was very much put out, and so he begged me to remember him kindly to my wife." That very evening, as it happened, Madame Bouchard had had a rather lively passage of arms with Monsieur d'Escaraille on the subject of this same Georges Duchesne. "Oh, well," she now deemed it advisable to say in a rather petulant voice, "Monsieur Duchesne will have to wait. I don't know that we need trouble ourselves about him." But her husband seemed quite determined. "No, no," he returned. "He deserves to be assistant head clerk, and he shall be. My credit is involved. Oh, I really can't stand injustice." This ends Chapter 12, Part 2. Chapter 12, Part 3 of His Excellency Eugene Rougon by Émile Zola, translated by Ernest Alfred Visitelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 12, Part 3. He grew so excited that some of the others had to soothe him. Clorinde, who appeared somewhat absent-minded, was in reality trying to hear the conversation between Monsieur Kahn and Monsieur La Rouquette, who had ensconced themselves at the foot of her bed. The former was explaining the state of his affairs. His great undertaking of a railway line between Niort and Angers was in a very critical position. The shares had at first been sold on the Bourse at a premium of 80 francs before a single stroke of work had been done. Relying upon his much-talked-of English company, Monsieur Kahn had indulged in the most reckless speculation, and now the whole business was on the verge of bankruptcy, and must collapse unless he could at once obtain some powerful support. "Some time ago," he said, "Marcy offered to bring about a sale of the concern to the Western Company. For myself, I'm quite ready to enter into negotiations. We should only want to get an act passed." Clorinde heard this, and thereupon quietly beckoned to the two men, who drew near and began a long conversation with her. Marcy, said the young woman, bore no spite. She would speak to him on the subject, and would offer him the 1,000,000 francs for which he had asked the previous year as his price for supporting the grant. His position as president of the Corps Législatif would make it an easy matter for him to get the necessary act passed. "Marcy's the only man who's of any good in matters of this kind," she added with a smile. "If you try to manage without him, you always have to call him in later on to patch up the broken pieces." However, all the other visitors were now speaking at once, and the room was full of noise. Madame Quereur was telling Madame Bouchard of her latest desire, which was to go to Collonges and die there in the family house. She grew quite pathetic as she spoke of a neighborhood where she had been born, and she declared that she would compel Madame Martineau to give up the house which was full of the associations of her childhood. Meantime, as was fatal, the men were again harping on the subject of Rougon. Monsieur d'Escuraille was describing the anger of his father and mother, who'd written to him upon learning how Rougon was abusing his power, bidding him break with the minister and return to the Council of State. The colonel, on his side, related how the fat man had flatly refused to ask the emperor for a post for him in the imperial palaces. Even Monsieur Bejois complained that His Majesty had never visited the cut-glass works at Saint-Florent upon the occasion of his journey to Bourges, although Rougon had solemnly promised to obtain that favor. And amidst all this babble, Countess Dalbi reclined smiling on her couch, looking the while at her still plump hands. "Flaminio," she said softly. Then the tall footman took a little tortoise-shell box full of mint lozenges out of his waistcoat pocket, and the Countess crunched these lozenges with an air of quiet enjoyment. It was nearly midnight when Delestan returned home. When they saw him raise the hangings of a doorway leading to the boudoir, they all became silent and turned anxiously towards him. But he let the curtain fall again. There was no one with him. Then, after a further pause, the visitors broke into various exclamations. "Are you by yourself? You haven't brought him with you, then? Have you lost the fat man on the way?" Truth to tell, there was a general feeling of relief. Delestan explained that Rougon had felt very tired and had left him at the corner of the Rue Marbeuf. "And a good thing, too!" exclaimed Clorinde, stretching herself out on the bed. "He's by no means entertaining." This was the signal for a fresh outburst of complaint and accusation. Delestan protested and tried to get a word in, for he usually made a pretense of defending Rougon. "There is no doubt that he might have acted better than he has done towards certain of his friends," he slowly said as soon as he was allowed to speak. "But, in spite of everything, he's a wonderfully clever fellow. I myself shall be eternally grateful to him." "Grateful for what?" cried Monsieur Kahn snappishly. "For all that he has done," but the others angrily interrupted him. Rougon had never done anything for him, they cried. What was it that he supposed Rougon had done for him? "You quite surprise me," said the colonel. "It is ridiculous to carry modesty to that extent. You don't stand in need of anyone's help, my dear friend. You have succeeded through your own merits." Then they all began to sound Delestan's praises. His model farm at La Chamade was something unparalleled, they asserted. It had long ago proved that he possessed all the qualifications of an able administrator and statesman. He had a quick eye, a clear mind, and a hand that was energetic without being rough. And besides, had not the emperor himself manifested the greatest appreciation of him all along? His Majesty and himself were in accord upon almost every point. "Pooh!" Monsieur Kahn ended by saying, "it is you who keep Rougon up. If you weren't his friend and didn't support him in the council, he would have come to grief a fortnight ago." Delestan, however, went on with his protestations. He himself might indeed be of some service, but it was only right to give everyone his due. That very evening at the Ministry of Justice, in discussing a very complicated financial question, Rougon had given proof of extraordinary lucidity of mind. "Oh, yes, I dare say," said Monsieur Larouquette scornfully. "The cunning of a smart attorney." Clorinde had not yet opened her lips. The visitors kept glancing at her, as though they expected her to say something. But for some time she rolled her head on her pillow, as though she were trying to rub the nape of her neck. "That's right, scold him," she said at last, speaking of her husband, though not mentioning him by name. "He will have to be beaten into taking his real place." "The position of Minister for Agriculture and Commerce is quite a secondary one," remarked Monsieur Kahn, in order to precipitate matters. This was touching a sore spot. Clorinde was annoyed at her husband being shelved to what she considered a minor post, and she now sharply sprang into a sitting posture and let fall the words that everyone had been waiting for. "He can go to the office of the Interior as soon as ever we wish it," said she. Delestan tried to speak, but all the company rushed towards him amid an outburst of delight. Then at last he seemed to give in. A rosy flush suffused his cheeks. His handsome face fairly beamed with pleasure. Madame Carreur and Madame Bouchard whispered to each other that he was remarkably good-looking, and the latter, with that perverted taste which makes some women admire baldness, cast loving glances at his bare skull. Then Monsieur Kahn, the colonel, and the others expressed by winks, gestures, and hasty words the high estimate which they set upon his ability. They prostrated themselves before the feeblest mind of the whole coterie, and admired one another in his person. He, at any rate, would be an easy and docile master, and would never compromise them. They could set him up as a god with impunity, free from all fear of his thunderbolts. "You are quite fatiguing him," at last exclaimed pretty Madame Bouchard in her tender voice. Fatiguing him, were they? At this there was a general outburst of sympathy. In point of fact, Delestan was looking rather pale again, and his eyes had a sleepy expression. But nothing tries a man like brain work, the visitors remarked to each other with an air of commiseration, and the poor fellow had been working since 5 o'clock that morning. Then they gently insisted that he should go to bed, and he obeyed them with quiet docility, kissing his wife on the forehead and then quitting the room. It was now 1 o'clock, and the guests began to speak of retiring, whereupon Clorinde assured them that she was by no means sleepy and that they might stay on. However, no one sat down again. The lamp in the boudoir had just gone out, and there was a strong smell of oil in the room. It was with difficulty that they could find sundry small articles, such as Madame Coreur's fan, the colonel's stick, and Madame Bouchard's bonnet. Clorinde, calmly stretched out on her bed, stopped Madame Carreur just as the latter was going to ring for Antonia. The maid, it appeared, always went to bed at 11 o'clock. Then, just as they were all going away, the colonel suddenly bethought himself of Auguste, whom he had forgotten. He found him asleep on a sofa in the boudoir, with his head resting on a dress which he'd rolled up to form a pillow, and the others scolded him for not having attended to the lamp. In the gloom of the staircase, where the gas was turned very low, Madame Bouchard gave a little scream. She had twisted her foot, she said. Finally, as the visitors carefully felt their way with the aid of the balusters, loud peals of laughter were heard upstairs, Pozzo having lingered after the others had gone. Every Thursday and Sunday the friends met at Clorinde's in this way, and it was generally rumored that Madame Delestan now held political receptions. It was said that extremely liberal proclivities were aired at them, and that Rougon's despotic administration was vigorously attacked. The whole band indeed had now begun to dream of a sort of democratic empire in which every public liberty would gradually expand. The colonel, in his leisure moments, drew up codes of rules for trade unions. Monsieur Bergeron spoke of building cheap workmen's houses round his cut-glass works at Saint-Florent, and Monsieur Kahn talked to Delestan for hours at a time of the democratic part that the Bonapartes were destined to play in modern society. And every fresh act of Rougon's was hailed with indignant protests, with expressions of patriotic alarm lest France should be ruined by such a man. One day Delestan started the theory that the emperor was the only genuine republican of his time. The coterie put on the airs of a religious sect to which the only means of salvation had been exclusively entrusted, and its members soon openly plotted the fat man's overthrow for the good of the country. Clorinde, however, showed no inclination for haste. They would find her lying at full length on one or other of the couches in her rooms, gazing into the air as if examining patches of the ceiling. And while the others prated and walked impatiently about the room, she remained silent and impenetrable, merely glancing at them every now and then, as though to advise them to be more guarded in their language. She now went out less than she'd done previously, and with Antonia's assistance often amused herself by dressing as a man, seemingly to while away her time. She manifested, too, a sudden affection for her husband, kissing him before company, talking caressingly to him, and showing a lively anxiety about his health, which was excellent. It might be that she adopted these tactics to conceal the absolute sway and ceaseless surveillance which she maintained over him. She directed his slightest actions, taught him his lesson every morning like a schoolboy who could not be trusted. Delestan on his side evinced the most docile obedience. He bowed, smiled, or frowned, said black was white or white was black, just as she pulled the string. And whenever he felt that he wanted winding up again, he voluntarily came back to her and placed himself in her hands to be manipulated. But all the while he seemed to outsiders to be the head of the household. Clorinde still waited. Monsieur Boulain-Dorcher, although he avoided coming to her evening receptions, frequently saw her during the day. He complained bitterly of his brother-in-law, whom he accused of making the fortunes of a crowd of strangers, while he seemed to think nothing of his own relatives. It was entirely Rougon's doing, he asserted, if the emperor had not entrusted the seals to himself. Rougon was afraid of having anyone in the council with whom he might have to share his influence. Clorinde did all she could to whet the judge's anger, and she also dropped hints of her husband's approaching triumph, and held out a vague hope that the rejected one might be included in the new ministry. She was, however, really making use of Boulain-Dorcher to find out what went on at Rougon's house. With feminine vindictiveness, she would have liked to see the great man unhappy in his domestic relations, and accordingly she spurred the judge on to persuade his sister to take his side against her husband. He tried to do so, no doubt, and may even have voiced his regrets respecting a marriage from which he had derived no benefit. But probably his words had no effect upon Madame Rougon's quiet, placid nature. To Clorinde he would say that his brother-in-law had seemed very nervous for some time past, and he would even hint that the fitting time for his overthrow had come. Then, with his eyes fixed on the young woman, but with the amiable way of one who in all innocence retails the gossip of society, he would recount a whole series of Rougon's characteristic actions. Why did she not act, if she were really mistress of the situation? He seemed to urge. But Clorinde only stretched herself out the more, and put on the air of one who is kept indoors by wet weather and must patiently await a ray of sunshine. However, at the Tuileries the young woman's influence was certainly increasing, and courtiers spoke in whispers of His Majesty's strong admiration for her. At the balls and official receptions, indeed, everywhere that the emperor met her, he was always hanging about her, casting sidelong glances at her, and whispering to her with a quiet smile. She, on her side, was playing her old part, the part she had played when she was looking for a husband, putting on the most enticing airs, behaving with a semblance of easy freedom, but always keeping on her guard, and making her escape at the critical moment. She seemed indeed to be biding her time, waiting for the hour when the emperor would be unable to refuse her any request that she might make of him. Doubtless she wished to secure the triumph of some long-planned scheme. It was about this time that she suddenly began to manifest great affection for Monsieur de Plougueron. For several months there had been a coolness between them. The old senator, who had been most constant in his attendance upon her, coming to see her almost every morning while she was dressing, was much annoyed one day at being refused admittance while she was engaged with her toilet. He thought this a great shame, for wasn't he her godfather, he asked, and hadn't he dandled her upon his knees when she was quite a little child? However, Monsieur de Plougueron urged all this in vain. Matters ended in a rupture, and whenever Monsieur Kahn or Colonel Jobelin happened to ask the young woman about the old senator, she would somewhat stiffly reply, "I'm told that he is growing young again, but I never see him now." This lasted for a time. Then, all at once, Monsieur de Plougueron was to be constantly found at her house. He wandered about in it at all hours of the day, doing Clorinde's bidding like a maid of all work. "Godfather, go and get me my nail file," she would say. "It is in the drawer, you know. Godfather, get me the sponge." She called him godfather in a caressing, affectionate manner. On his side, he now frequently spoke of Count Dalbi, and gave details of Clorinde's birth. He asserted that he'd been introduced to her mother but a short time before that birth, which was distinctly false. However, the relative positions of the two were never clearly ascertained, nor did people learn what business it was that had again brought Clorinde and the old senator together. In all probability, he was just then necessary to her. She had some part for him to play in a drama of which she was constantly dreaming. She would indeed talk to him in obscure terms of some vague, indefinite event which was very slowly approaching consummation. And on his side he seemed to be calculating combinations like a chess player, though he generally ended by shaking his head, as though he could come to no satisfactory conclusion. On the few occasions when Rougon came to see Clorinde, she affected great weariness and spoke of going to Italy for 3 months. But then, with lowered eyelids, she would examine him with a sharp, gleaming glance, while a smile of refined cruelty hardened her lips. She would have liked to strangle him then and there with her tapering fingers, but she was anxious that her attack should prove quite effective when it did come, and this long wait for the time when her nails would be fully grown was not without a spice of pleasure to her. Rougon, who was always very absent-minded, shook hands with her mechanically, never noticing the nervous fever of her flesh. He even fancied that she'd given up her eccentricities, and complimented her upon rendering obedience to her husband. "You are now nearly all that I wished you to be," he said to her. "You've taken the right course. Women ought to remain quietly at home." "Good heavens, what an idiot he is!" she exclaimed with a shrill laugh when he'd gone away. "And he thinks that it is the women who are the idiots." At last, one Sunday evening towards 10 o'clock, when the whole band had assembled in Clorinde's bedroom, Monsieur de Plougern came in with a triumphant air. "Well," he exclaimed, trying to appear extremely indignant, "have you heard of Rougon's last exploit? This time, surely, the measure is full." They all eagerly clustered round him. No one had heard of anything. "Ah, it is abominable," he added, excitedly waving his arm in the air. "It is inconceivable that a minister could sink to such depths." Then he entered into particulars. When the Charbonnels had gone to Faverolles to take possession of their cousin Chevassous's property, they had made a great outcry about the alleged disappearance of a large quantity of silver plate. They accused the woman who'd been left in charge of the house, a very pious person, of having stolen it. They asserted that this miserable creature, upon learning the decision of the Council of State, had conspired with the sisters of the Holy Family and carried to their convent all such valuables as could easily be concealed. 3 days later, the Charbonnels dropped the accusations against the housekeeper and charged the sisters themselves with having ransacked the house. This caused a terrible scandal in the town. However, the commissary of police still refused to search the convent when Rougon, after receiving a letter from the Charbonnels, telegraphed to the prefect directing him to order a strict perquisition at once. "Yes, a strict perquisition. Those were the words in the message," Monsieur de Plougern said in conclusion. And then the commissary and 2 gendarmes were seen ransacking the convent. They were there for 5 hours. The gendarmes insisted upon poking into every corner. They even examined the sisters' beds to see if the missing plate were under the mattresses. "Oh, how abominable!" cried Madame Bouchard in disgust. "He must be entirely destitute of the slightest idea of religion," declared the colonel. "Well, what can you expect?" added Madame Courreau. "Rougon has never conformed with the requirements of faith. I often tried to reconcile him with God, but always failed in my efforts." Monsieur Bouchard and Monsieur Bejoin shook their heads in a hopeless sort of way, as though they just heard of some frightful social catastrophe which made them despair of humanity, while Monsieur Khan, energetically rubbing his fringe of beard, inquired, "Of course, they discovered nothing in the convent?" "Absolutely nothing," replied Monsieur de Plougerne. Then he continued hastily, "A silver saucepan, I think, 2 cups, and a cruet stand. Mere trifles. Presents which the esteemed deceased, an old man of extreme piety, had given to the sisters in acknowledgment of their kind attention to him during his long illness." "Yes, yes, of course," said the others. The old senator dwelt no further on that subject, but in a very deliberate way, accentuating each sentence by bringing one hand down upon the other, he resumed, "That, however, is not the important point. The question is one of the respect due to a convent, to one of those holy houses where the virtues, driven from our impious society, have sought refuge. How can we expect the masses to be religious when they see attacks made upon religion by men in such high positions? Rougon has been guilty of utter sacrilege in this matter, and he will be called to account for it. All the decent-minded folks in Faverolles are bursting with indignation. Monseigneur Rochard, the well-known bishop, who has always manifested a particular affection for the sisters, has come to Paris to demand justice. In the Senate, too, today, a great deal of annoyance was shown, and there was some talk of raising a discussion on the strength of a few details which I was able to supply. And finally, the Empress herself." Every head was now eagerly craned forward. "Yes, the Empress has learnt this deplorable story from Madame de Lorentz, who heard it from our friend La Rouquette, to whom I myself told it. When she heard it, Her Majesty exclaimed, 'Monsieur Rougon is no longer worthy of speaking in the name of France.'" "Quite right," said all the others. All through that Thursday night, and until 1 o'clock the next morning, nothing else was talked of. Clorinde had not opened her mouth, and Monsieur de Plougern's first words, she had lain back on her couch, looking a little pale and compressing her lips. Then, unnoticed, she quickly crossed herself 3 times, as though thanking heaven for having at last granted her a long-entreated favor. The narrative of the perquisition wrung from her various gestures expressive of outraged piety, and gradually she flushed quite red. Then, gazing up towards the dim ceiling, she became absorbed in reverie. And while the others were discussing the matter, Monsieur de Plougerne glided to the young woman's side, and with his skeptical snigger softly whispered in her ear, "He has insulted God Almighty. He is done for." This ends Chapter 12, Part 3. Chapter 13, Part 1 of His Excellency Eugene Rougon by Émile Zola, translated by Ernest Alfred Visitelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 13, Part 1, Clorinde's Revenge. During the ensuing week, Rougon heard a growing clamor rise around him. Everything else might have been forgiven: his abuse of power, the grasping greed of his band, and the choking grip in which he held the whole country. But to have sent gendarmes to poke about the cells of the sisters was so monstrous a crime that the ladies of the court affected to shudder when he passed them. Then, too, Monseigneur Rochard was creating a terrible commotion throughout the official world, and it was said that he had even complained to the Empress herself on the subject. Moreover, the scandal was doubtless kept alive by a few wily individuals who were bent on making the most of it, for orders and suggestions circulated, and the same complaints were raised at once in every quarter. Amidst all these furious attacks, Rougon at first maintained a perfectly serene and smiling demeanor. He shrugged his broad shoulders and spoke scoffingly of the whole matter. At an evening reception at the Ministry of Justice, he even remarked, "By the way, I never told you that they found a priest hidden in the convent." However, when this sally circulated, there was a fresh outburst of anger, and then he, on his side, at last became impassioned. People were making him quite sick with all their foolish talk, he said. The sisters were certainly thieves, for silver cups and saucepans had been discovered in their possession, and he actually showed an inclination to take further steps in the matter, made inquiries, and threatened to overwhelm the whole clergy of Faverolles with confusion in the law courts. Early one morning, however, the Charbonnels presented themselves before him, at which he was much astonished, for he did not know that they were even in Paris. As soon as he saw them, he exclaimed that matters were proceeding most satisfactorily, and that he had sent instructions to the prefect to compel the public prosecutor to take active steps. But at this, Monsieur Charbonnel assumed an expression of consternation, and Madame Charbonnel replied, "No, we don't want that. You've gone too far, Monsieur Rougon. You have quite misunderstood us." Then they both began to sing the praises of the sisters of the Holy Family, who were extremely good women, they said, though they themselves had for a moment gone to law against them. They'd never ventured so far as to accuse them of anything base. Such a charge would have produced the greatest amazement in Faverolles, where everyone in society held the sisters in such high esteem. "You will do us the greatest injury, Monsieur Rougon," Madame Charbonnel said in conclusion, "if you continue to show such violence towards religion. We've come to pray you to desist from further action. Down yonder, people don't understand the real state of affairs, but think that it is we who are hounding you on. So if you don't stop, they will end by stoning us. We have made a handsome present to the convent, an ivory crucifix, which used to hang at the foot of our poor cousin's bed." "Well, we've warned you now," added Monsieur Charbonnel, "and the responsibility rests with you. We have nothing further to do with the business." Rougon let them talk on. They seemed to be very much displeased with him, and gradually raised their voices in indignation. As the minister looked at them, he felt a slight chill and sudden lassitude, as though some portion of his strength had again been ravished from him. However, he made no attempt to discuss the subject, but dismissed his visitors, promising that he would take no further steps in the affair, and indeed, so far as he was concerned, he let the whole matter die out. During the last few days, his name had been indirectly mixed up in another scandal. A frightful tragedy had taken place at Coulanges. Dupoisson, obstinately intent upon getting the better of his father, had again one morning knocked at the old miser's door. 5 minutes afterwards, the neighbors heard the sound of gunshots in the house, accompanied by fearful shrieks. When they made their way inside, they found the old man stretched at the foot of a staircase with his head split open. 2 discharged guns were lying on the hall floor, and Dupoisson told them, with a livid face, that his father, upon seeing him advance towards the staircase, had suddenly shouted, "Thieves!" as though he were mad, and had fired upon him twice, almost touching him with the muzzle of his gun. In proof of this, he even showed them a bullet hole in his hat. However, said he, just as his father was advancing still nearer, he had fallen and broken his skull against the bottom step. This tragical death, this mysterious, unwitnessed drama, had given rise to the most unpleasant rumors throughout the department. The doctors said that it was clear that the old man had died of an attack of apoplexy. Nevertheless, the prefect's enemies insinuated that he must have given his father a push, and the number of these enemies increased day by day, owing to the harshness of his rule, which oppressed Niort as with a reign of terror. Stern and pale, with his teeth clenched and his hands twitching, Dupoisson had to check the gossips on their doorsteps with a glance from his fierce grey eyes as he passed along the streets. However, another misfortune befell him. He was obliged to remove Gilquin, who had compromised himself by taking a bribe to procure a conscript exemption from the service. It was his wont to promise exemption to peasant sons on being paid 100 francs a head. All that du Poissac could do for Gilles Can in the matter was to save him from prosecution, and then disown him. So far the sub-prefect had relied entirely upon Rougon, and had tried to make him more and more responsible for every matter that went wrong. Now, however, he probably divined something of the minister's critical position, for he came to Paris without giving him any intimation of his intention to do so. He felt his own position to be very much shaken, and, fearing the collapse of the power which he had so largely helped to ruin, he was already on the lookout for the support of some influential hand. He contemplated asking permission to change his prefecture in order to escape certain dismissal. Indeed, since his father's death and Gilles Can's knavery, Niort was becoming quite impossible for him. "I just met Monsieur de Poissac in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré," Clorinde mischievously said to the minister one day. "Aren't you good friends now? He seems very bitter against you." Rougon avoided making any reply. After being compelled to refuse several favors to the prefect, he'd become conscious of increasing coldness between them, and they now simply confined themselves to official intercourse. The desertion was becoming general. Even Madame Coureur had abandoned Rougon. On certain evenings he again experienced that feeling of loneliness which he had formerly felt in the Rue Marbeuf when his friends were doubting his star. At the close of his busy days, amidst the crowd of visitors who besieged his drawing-room, he felt alone and lost and heartbroken because his old familiar friends were not there. And he once more began to feel an overwhelming craving for the continuous praises of the Colonel and Monsieur Bouchard, for all the vitalizing warmth with which his little court had once encompassed him. He even regretted Monsieur Bejoin's silence, and so he made an attempt to win his old associates back again by showing himself very pleasant and amiable, writing to them and even venturing to call on them. But the ties were broken, and he could never succeed in getting them all around him. If he contrived to piece up the links at one end of the chain, some mischance kept those at the other end broken. The chain remained imperfect in spite of every endeavor. Some of his old friends were invariably absent. At last they all abandoned him. This was the death agony of his power. He, strong as he was bound to those foolish weaklings by the long labor of their common fortune, and as each deserted him, a piece of his being seemed to be ravished away. His strength and abilities remained, as it were, useless in this lessening of his importance. His big fists only struck the empty air. On the day when his shadow alone showed in the sunshine, and he could no longer add to it by an abuse of power and patronage, it seemed to him as if he held but little room in the world, and he began to dream of a new incarnation, a resurrection in the shape of some Jupiter Tonans, with no band at his feet, but ruling by the sole power of his voice. However, Rougon did not yet feel that his position was seriously threatened. He treated with disdain the bites that scarcely touched his heels. He went on governing with stern decision, unpopular and solitary. His great reliance was on the emperor. His only weakness was his credulity. Each time that he saw his majesty, he found him kindly disposed and amiable, ever preserving his impenetrable smile, and the emperor invariably renewed his expressions of confidence and repeated the instructions which he had so frequently given before. This seemed quite sufficient to Rougon. His sovereign could have no thought of sacrificing him. His feeling of security led him to venture on a deep stroke of policy. To silence his enemies and place his authority on a firmer footing than ever, he sent in his resignation couched in the most dignified terms. He spoke of the complaints which were being circulated against him, and asserted that he had strictly obeyed the emperor's commands. But at the same time he felt the need of his majesty's undoubted approval before further continuing his labors for the public weal. Moreover, He undisguisedly championed a stern policy, posed as the representative of merciless repression. The court was at Fontainebleau at the time, and the resignation having been dispatched, Rougon awaited the result with the confidence of a cool gamester. All the recent scandals, the tragedy at Coulanges, the perquisition at the convent of the Sisters of the Holy Family, would be blotted out, he thought. At any rate, if he were destined to fall, he wished to fall boldly, like the strong man he was. On the day when the minister's fate was to be decided, it so happened that a bazaar was held at the orangerie in the Tuileries Gardens in support of an orphanage which the Empress patronized. All the palace circle and the high officials would certainly attend out of respect for their majesties, and Rougon resolved that he also would go and show them his unruffled face. It was quite a piece of bravado, this idea of boldly confronting the people who cast furtive glances at him, of thus exhibiting his contemptuous unconcern amidst their hostile whispers. Towards 3 o'clock, while he was giving a final order to his chief subordinate, his valet came to tell him that a lady and gentleman particularly wished to see him in his private rooms. The card which the servant brought bore the names of the Marquise and Marchioness d'Escorrailles. The two old people, whom the valet, deceived by their almost shabby appearance, had left in the dining-room, rose ceremoniously when Rougon appeared. He hastened to lead them into the drawing-room, feeling some emotion at their presence and also a thrill of disquietude. However, he spoke of their arrival in Paris as an unexpected pleasure and tried to appear as amiable as possible. But the Marquis and his wife remained cold and stiff and sullen. "Monsieur," at length said the Marquise, "you will excuse, I hope, the step we have considered it necessary to take. It concerns our son Jules. We wish him to retire from the administration. We ask you to keep him no longer about you." Then, as the minister looked at him with extreme surprise, he added, "Young people are not to be depended upon. We have twice written to Jules, telling him our reasons in desiring him to send in his resignation. As he has not obeyed our instructions, we at last determined to come ourselves. This is the second time, monsieur, that we have come to Paris in 30 years. Then Rougon began to protest. Jules had the most promising future before him, said he. They would simply ruin his career. But the Marchioness made a gesture of impatience and began to explain her reasons with more animation than her husband had shown. "It is not for us, Monsieur Rougon, to judge you," she said, "but there are certain traditions in our family. Jules must not be mixed up in any abominable persecution of the church. Everyone at Plassans is amazed already. We should embroil ourselves with the whole nobility of the neighborhood." Rougon at once understood what was amiss. He was going to reply, but the Marchioness silenced him with an imperious gesture. "Let me finish," she said. "Our son entered the public service in spite of our protests. You know what grief we felt at seeing him take office under an illegitimate government. It was all I could do to keep his father from cursing him. However, our house has been in mourning ever since, and when we receive our friends, the name of our son is never mentioned. We had sworn that we would trouble ourselves about him no longer, but there are limits to everything, and it is intolerable that an Escorrailles should be mixed up with the enemies of our holy faith. You hear me, do you not, monsieur?" Rougon bowed. He did not even think of smiling at the old lady's pious fibs. She and her husband once more stood before him proud and haughty and disdainful, as in the old days when he prowled about Plassans, pinched with hunger. If anyone else had used such language to him, he would certainly have had them turned out by the lackeys. But now he felt wounded, distressed, shrunken, as it were. He again thought of his youth of sordid poverty, and for a moment could almost have fancied that he was wearing his old worn-down shoes once more. However, he promised that he would use his influence with Jules to make him conform with his parents' wishes. And then, alluding to the reply which he was awaiting from the Emperor, he just added, It is quite possible, madame, that your son will be restored to you this very evening." When he was alone again, Rougon felt a thrill of fear. That old couple had succeeded in disturbing his hitherto unruffled placidity. He now hesitated about going to the bazaar, where all eyes would read his perturbation on his face. He felt ashamed, however, of this childish fear, and so passed through his study on his way out. Then he asked Merle if anything had come for him. "No, your Excellency," respectfully replied the usher, who had been on the lookout all the morning. The orangery in the Tuileries Gardens, where the bazaar was being held, had been sumptuously decorated for the occasion. Crimson velvet hangings with fringes of gold concealed the walls and transformed the huge bare gallery into a lofty gala hall. Towards one end, on the left, large curtains, also of crimson velvet, were stretched across the gallery, cutting off a portion of it. They were, however, looped up with bands ornamented with huge golden tassels so as to afford free communication between the chief section of the hall, where the stalls were ranged on either side, and the smaller division where a refreshment counter had been fitted up. The floor was strewn with fine sand, and in each corner stood majolica pots containing rare plants. In the middle of the square space formed by the stalls there was a low circular settee upholstered in velvet and with a very sloping back. And from the center of it a huge column of flowers shot up, a sheaf of stems amongst which drooped roses, carnations, and verbenas, like a shower of dazzling drops. On a terrace overlooking the Seine, in front of the folding glass doors which had been thrown wide open, some grave-looking ushers in black dress coats glanced at the cards of the invités as they arrived. The lady patronesses did not expect many people before 4 o'clock. Erect behind their stalls in the great hall, they waited for customers to arrive. Their wares were spread out on long tables covered with crimson cloth. There were several stalls of Parisian and Chinese fancy goods, 2 of children's toys, a florist's kiosk crammed full of roses, and lastly, inside a tent, a lucky wheel, like those to be seen at the fairs in the Parisian suburbs. The stall-holders, in low-necked theatre dresses, assumed all the persuasive graces of shopkeepers, the seductive smiles of modistes trying to palm off old-fashioned goods, and they modulated their voices alluringly as they prattled and puffed their wares. They made themselves quite familiar with everyone who came to purchase of them. A princess presided over one of the toy stalls, and in front of her, on the opposite side of the hall, a marchioness sold purses which had cost 29 sous for 20 francs apiece. These 2 were rivals, each seeking to make a larger sum of money than the other. They seized hold of customers, called out to the men, and asked the most shameless prices, and after bargaining as greedily as thievish butchers, they would throw in the tips of their fingers or a glimpse of their bosoms to turn the scale and complete some remunerative transaction. Charity was, of course, their excuse. Little by little the hall gradually filled. Gentlemen calmly halted and examined the stall-holders, as though the latter formed part of the goods for sale. Fashionably dressed young fellows crowded round certain stalls, laughing and flirting, while the lady sellers flitted from one to another with inexhaustible complacence, offering all their wares in turn with the same charming expression. It seemed quite an enjoyment to them. Sales by auction could be heard proceeding, interrupted by joyous peals of laughter amid the low tramping over the sanded floor. The crimson hangings softened the bright light from the lofty windows and diffused a ruddy glow, which here and there set a pinky touch on the stall-holders' bare necks and shoulders. And in the space between the stalls 6 other ladies, a baroness, 2 bankers' daughters, and the wives of 3 high officials, threaded their way among the public with light baskets hanging from their necks. These darted upon each new arrival, crying cigars and matches. However, Madame de Combelot met with particular success. She was the flower girl, and sat on a high seat in the rose-crammed kiosk, a carved and gilded affair which looked like a great pigeon-cote. She was dressed in a tight-fitting rose-colored dress, the corsage of which was very low. And she wore no jewelry, but simply the regulation bunch of violets nestling on her bosom. To make herself as much like a genuine flower girl as possible, it had occurred to her to tie up her bouquets in public, holding the wire between her teeth and twisting it round a full-blown rose, a bud and 3 leaves, which she sold at prices ranging from 1 to 10 louis, according to the appearance of her customers. And her bouquets were in such demand that she could not make them quickly enough, while every now and then she pricked herself in her haste and quickly sucked the blood from her fingers. In the canvas tent opposite the flower stall, pretty Madame Bouchard presided over the lucky wheel. She was wearing a charming blue peasant costume, high-waisted and with a fichu-shaped bodice, indeed almost a disguise which gave her quite the appearance of a vendor of cakes and gingerbread. She also affected a pretty lisp and a guileless air which was very original. Over the lucky wheel were displayed the different prizes, some hideous trifles in leather, glass, and china, worth 4 or 5 sous apiece. And every few moments, whenever there was a lack of patrons, Madame Bouchard called out in her pretty, innocent voice, which suggested some simple Susan fresh from her village, "Try your luck, gentlemen. Only 20 sous a time. Try your luck, gentlemen." The refreshment room, which, like the larger hall, had its floor sanded and its corners decorated with rare plants, was furnished with little round tables and cane-seated chairs. It had been made to resemble a café as much as possible. At one end, behind a massive counter, were 3 ladies who fanned themselves while waiting for orders. Decanters of liqueur, plates of cakes and sandwiches, sweetmeats, cigars and cigarettes were set out in front of them, recalling the kind of display which one sees at the buffets of questionable dancing saloons. Every few moments the lady in the middle, a dark and petulant countess, rose and bent forward to pour out a glass of something or other, seeming quite bewildered amidst all those decanters, and dashing her bare arms about at the risk of breaking everything. It was Clorinde, however, who was the real queen of the buffet. It was she who handed the customers the refreshments they ordered when they sat down at the little tables. She looked like Juno masquerading as a waiting-maid. She wore a yellow satin robe slashed slantwise with black satin, a dazzling, extraordinary arrangement which suggested a blazing star with a comet's tail sweeping after it. Her bodice was cut very low, and she sailed about majestically amidst the cane-seated chairs, carrying her glasses on a pewter tray with all the serenity of a goddess. Her bare elbows brushed against the men's shoulders, and her bosom showed conspicuously as she bent down to take their orders, evincing no haste as she did so, but answering everyone with a smile, apparently quite at her ease. When the refreshments had been consumed, she received in her queenly hand the silver and copper coins tendered in payment, and with a gesture that had already become familiar to her, dropped them into a bag hanging from her waist. At last Monsieur Kahn and Monsieur Bejoin came into the buffet and sat down. The former jocosely rapped the zinc table at which he installed himself, just as if he might have done at a café, and called, "2 beers, madame." Clorinde hastened up, served the 2 glasses of beer, and then remained standing near the table to snatch a little rest, as just then there happened to be very few customers. And while she wiped her fingers on which some beer had trickled, Monsieur Kahn noticed the peculiar brightness of her eyes, the expression of triumph with which her whole face shone. He blinked at her for a moment, and then asked, "When did you get back from Fontainebleau?" "This morning," she replied. "You've seen the Emperor, then, I suppose? Well, what is the news?" Clorinde smiled, compressed her lips in a peculiar fashion, and then in her turn looked at Monsieur Kahn. The latter thereupon noticed that she was wearing an eccentric ornament which he'd never seen before. It was a dog collar encircling her bare neck, a real dog collar of black velvet, with buckle, ring, and bell. The bell was of gold, and a pearl tinkled inside it. Upon the collar there were 2 names in letters of diamonds, oddly twisted and interlaced. and from the ring a thick gold chain fell over her bosom and then rose again, ending in a gold plate fastened to her right arm, on which were these words, "I belong to my master." "Is that a present?" softly asked Monsieur Kahn, pointing to the ornament. Clorinde nodded assent, still keeping her lips compressed with a cunning, sensual expression. She had desired this servitude, and she paraded it with shameless serenity, as though she felt honored by a sovereign's choice, an object of envy to every other woman. When she made her appearance with this collar round her neck, on which the keen eyes of rivals fancied they could decipher an illustrious name interlaced with her own, every woman present had understood the truth, and had exchanged significant glances with her acquaintances. However, business in the refreshment room was suddenly becoming brisk. "A glass of beer, madame, please," said a fat gentleman wearing a decoration, a general, as he looked at Clorinde, smiling. When she'd brought the beer, 2 deputies asked her for some chartreuse. A crowd was now pouring into the buffet, and orders were given on all sides for liqueur, lemonade, biscuits, and cigars. And the men, while staring at Clorinde, repeated in whispers the various stories which were current. For her part, she turned her neck in all serenity, the better indeed to show her dog collar and the heavy gold chain which tinkled as she moved. That she had been a queen of the left hand imparted additional piquancy to her present assumption of the part of a waiting maid, who, answering everyone's beck and call, dragged statuesque feet, which had been passionately kissed by august moustaches, over the floor of a mock cafe, amongst pieces of lemon peel and biscuit crumbs. "It's really quite amusing," the young woman said, as she came back and stood by Monsieur Kahn. "One of the gentlemen actually gave me a pinch just now. But I didn't say anything. What would have been the good? It's all for the sake of the poor, isn't it?" Monsieur Kahn motioned to her to stoop, and when she had done so, he whispered, "Well, what about Rougon?" "Hush! You'll know everything soon," she replied, in equally low tones. "I have sent him an invitation card, and I am expecting his arrival." Then, as Monsieur Kahn wagged his head, she added with animation, Yes, I know him. I'm sure he'll come. And besides, he knows nothing of what has happened." Monsieur Kahn and Monsieur Bejoin then began to look out anxiously for Rougon's appearance. They could see the whole of the large hall through the opening in the curtains. The crowd there was increasing every minute. On the circular settee several men were lounging with their knees crossed and their eyes sleepily closed, while a continual flow of visitors brushed against their feet as it streamed past. The heat was becoming excessive, and the hubbub grew ever louder in the roseate haze that floated over the forest of black silk hats. Every few moments, too, the grating, rattling sound of a lucky wheel could be heard. Madame Coeur, who had just arrived, was going slowly round the stalls. She looked very fat in her gown of grenadine striped white and mauve, and there was a shrewd expression on her face, the calculating air of the customer who looks about her with the intention of making some advantageous bargain. There were plenty of such to be made, she said, at these charitable bazaars, for the ladies often did not know the value of their wares. However, she never bought anything of such stall-holders as were friends of her own, for they always tried to take advantage of her. When she'd been all round the hall, moving the different goods about, examining them and putting them back in their places again, she returned to a stall where some fancy articles in leather were displayed for sale. And here she remained for fully 10 minutes, turning everything over with an air of perplexity. At last, she carefully took up a Russian leather pocketbook on which she'd really cast her eyes a quarter of an hour previously. "How much?" she asked. The stall-holder, a tall, fair, young woman, who was joking with 2 gentlemen, scarcely turned as she replied, 15 francs. The pocketbook was worth at least 20. These ladies, who contended with each other in wresting extravagant prices from the men, generally sold their goods to visitors of their own sex at cost price, actuated in the matter by a sort of Freemasonry. Madame Coqueur, however, laid the pocketbook on the stall again and put on an expression of alarm. "Oh, it is too expensive," she said. "I want something for a present, but I don't wish to give more than 10 francs. Have you got anything nice for 10 francs? Then she began to turn all the goods over again. Nothing, however, seemed to suit her. What a pity it was that the pocketbook was so dear. She took it up again and poked her nose into the pockets, whereupon the stall-holder, growing impatient, at last offered to sell it to her for 14 francs, and then for 12. That, however, was still too much according to Madame Coqueur, who, after much keen bargaining, succeeded in getting it for 11. "I prefer selling things if I can," said the tall young woman. "All the ladies bargain, and not one of them buys anything. If it weren't for the gentlemen, I don't know what we should do." As Madame Coqueur went off, she had the satisfaction of finding inside the pocketbook a ticket denoting that the real price was 25 francs. Then she strolled about again, and finally installed herself behind the lucky wheel by the side of Madame Bouchard, whom she called her pet, and whose side curls she began to arrange. This ends Chapter 13, Part 1. Chapter 13, Part 2 of His Excellency Eugene Rougon by Émile Zola, translated by Ernest Alfred Visitelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 13, Part 2. "Ah, here comes the Colonel!" suddenly exclaimed Monsieur Kahn, who was still sitting in the refreshment room with his eyes fixed upon the entrance. The Colonel had come because he could not very well help doing so. He hoped, however, to get off with the expenditure of a louis, though the thought of even that small outlay was already making his heart bleed. As soon as he made his appearance, he was surrounded and attacked by 3 or 4 ladies, who repeated, "Buy a cigar of me, monsieur! A box of matches, monsieur!" The Colonel smiled and politely extricated himself from their skirts. Then he looked round him, and coming to the conclusion that he had better spend his money at once, he went up to a stall presided over by a lady high in favour at court, of whom he inquired the price of a very ugly cigar case. 75 francs. The Colonel could not suppress a gesture of alarm, and dropping the cigar case, he hurriedly escaped, while the lady, flushing red and feeling offended, turned her head away, as though he'd been guilty of some shocking impropriety in her presence. Then the Colonel, desirous of preventing any unpleasant comments, went up to the kiosk where Madame de Combelow was still manufacturing her little bouquets. These, at any rate, could not be so very expensive, he thought. However, he would not even venture upon the purchase of a bouquet, for he felt sure that Madame de Combelow would put a fairly good price upon her handiwork. So from amongst the heap of roses he chose a cankered bud, the poorest and most insignificant he could see. "What is the price of this flower, madame?" he then inquired, with a great show of politeness, as he took out his purse. 100 francs, monsieur," replied the lady, who'd been stealthily watching his maneuvers. The Colonel began to stammer, and his hands trembled. This time, however, he felt that retreat was impossible. There were several people watching him. So he reluctantly paid his money, and then sought refuge in the refreshment room. "It is an abominable swindle, an abominable swindle," he muttered, as he took a seat at Monsieur Kahn's table. "You haven't seen anything of Rougon in the hall, have you?" asked Monsieur Kahn. The Colonel made no reply. He was casting furious sidelong glances at the stall-holders. Then, hearing Monsieur Descorailles and Monsieur La Rouquette laughing loudly in front of one of the stalls, he ground out between his teeth, "Ah, it's all very well for those young fellows. They manage to get something for their money." Monsieur d'Escorhaille and Monsieur Larouquette certainly seemed to be amusing themselves. The ladies at the stalls were struggling to get possession of them. As soon as they'd made their appearance, all hands had beckoned to them, and they were called on every side. "Monsieur d'Escorhaille, you know that you promised me." "Now, Monsieur Larouquette, do buy this little horse of me." "No? Well, you shall buy a doll then." "Yes, a doll. A doll's exactly what you want." The two young men were walking arm in arm for mutual protection, as they playfully asserted. They advanced radiant, enraptured through the attacking battalion of petticoats, greeted with a caressing chorus of sweet voices. Every now and then they disappeared amidst a wave of bare shoulders, against which they pretended to defend themselves with little cries of alarm. And at every stall they allowed themselves to be attacked. Then they began to affect miserliness, and to assume the most comical expressions of surprise. "What? A louis for a doll that wasn't worth more than a sou?" Oh, that was quite beyond their means. "2 louis for 3 pencils? What, did the ladies want to reduce them to starvation?" The ladies were immensely amused, and their pretty laughter rippled on in flute-like strains. They grew keener than ever, quite intoxicated by the shower of gold raining around them, and trebled and quadrupled their prices in their craving for plunder. They passed the young men on from stall to stall with significant winks, and such remarks as, "I'll squeeze them well," or "You can stick it on with them," were bandied about, remarks which the two young fellows heard and acknowledged with playful bows. Behind them the ladies triumphed and boasted one to the other. The cleverest and most envied was a girl of 18, who'd sold one of them a stick of sealing wax for 3 louis. However, when they at last reached the end of the hall, and a lady insisted upon forcing a box of soap into Monsieur d'Escorhaille's pocket, he shook his purse before her face, saying, "But I haven't a copper left. Shall I give you a promissory note for the money?" The lady, who was quite excited, took the purse and searched it. Then she looked at the young man, and it seemed as though she was on the point of asking him for his watch chain. However, it was all a trick on Monsieur d'Escorhaille's part. On such occasions he took an empty purse with him by way of amusement. "Come, let's be off," he said, dragging Monsieur Larouquette away. "I'm going to be stingy now. We must try to recoup ourselves, eh?" "Try your luck, gentlemen. 20 sous a chance," called Madame Bouchard as they passed in front of the lucky wheel. They at once approached her, and went into the business enthusiastically. For a quarter of an hour the lucky wheel was kept going without cessation. First one, then the other set it spinning. Monsieur d'Escorhaille won 24 egg cups, 3 little looking-glasses, 7 china figures, and 5 cigarette cases, while Monsieur Larouquette's winnings consisted of 2 packets of lace, a china tray mounted on feet of gilded zinc, some glasses, a candlestick, and a box with a glass cover. Madame Bouchard became indignant. "Come, that's enough," said she. "You're too lucky. I won't let you go on any longer. Here, take your winnings away." She had arranged them in 2 big piles upon a table beside her. Monsieur Larouquette seemed filled with consternation at the sight of them, and asked her to exchange them for the regulation bunch of violets which she was wearing in her hair. But she declined to do so. "No, no," she said, "you've won those things, haven't you? Very well, then, take them away with you." "Madame is quite right," remarked Monsieur d'Escorhaille gravely. "We mustn't despise fortune, and for my part I do not mean to leave a single egg cup behind me. I'm getting stingy." He had spread out his handkerchief and was tying his winnings up in a neat bundle, which caused a fresh burst of gaiety. And Monsieur Larouquette's embarrassment was equally amusing. But at last Madame Coureur, who had hitherto kept in the background with smiling matronly dignity, protruded her fat rosy face. She would be very glad to make an exchange, said she. "Oh no, I don't want anything," the young deputy hastily exclaimed. "Take the whole lot. I make you a present of everything." He and Esquerey did not, however, take themselves off at once, but began to whisper doubtful compliments to Madame Bouchard. Turning a lucky wheel was all very well, they told her, but she knew much better how to turn men's heads. Meanwhile, Madame Bouchard dropped her eyelashes and giggled like a peasant girl chaffed by gentlemen. Madame Coquart gazed at her in admiration. "Isn't she sweet? Isn't she sweet?" she exclaimed every now and then, with a rapturous expression. But Madame Bouchard at last began to rap Monsieur d'Esquerey's fingers, for he wanted to examine the mechanism of the lucky wheel, alleging that it did not work fairly. "Would they never leave her at peace?" she cried. As there was nothing more to be got out of them, they'd better go. And when she at length managed to get rid of them, she again began to call in a coaxing voice, "Only 20 sous a spin, gentlemen. Come and try one spin." At that moment, Monsieur Kahn, who'd risen from his chair to look over the heads of the crowd, hastily sat down again. "Here's Rougon coming," he exclaimed. "Let's pretend not to see him." Rougon was slowly making his way up the hall. He stopped first at Madame Bouchard's tent, tried his fortune at the lucky wheel, and afterwards purchased a rose from Madame de Combelot for 3 louis. Having thus contributed to the funds of a charity, he seemed inclined to take his departure. He elbowed his way through the throng, already turning towards one of the doors. But all at once, having glanced into the refreshment room, he abruptly altered his course and entered the buffet proudly, calmly, with head erect. Monsieur d'Esquerey and Monsieur La Rouquette had now taken seats beside Monsieur Kahn, Monsieur Bejoin, and the Colonel. Monsieur Bouchard also came up and joined them, and all of them trembled slightly as the minister passed by, so big and strong did he seem to them with those massive limbs of his. He greeted them familiarly in a loud, distinct voice, and seated himself at a neighboring table. He kept his broad face raised, and turned it slowly to the right and left, as though anxious to confront unflinchingly the glances which he felt were fixed upon him. Clorinde stepped up to him, dragging her heavy yellow train majestically behind her. "What will you take?" she asked him, affecting a vulgarity of manners not untinged with raillery. "Ah, that's the question," he answered gaily. "I never drink anything, you know. What have you got?" Clorinde went rapidly through her list of liqueurs: brandy, rum, curaçao, kirschwater, chartreuse, vespetro, anisette, and kummel. No, I won't have any of those. Give me a glass of sugared water." She went off to the counter and came back with the glass of sugared water, still preserving an air of goddess-like majesty. And she lingered in front of Rougon, watching him stir the sugar. The minister continued to smile, making the first commonplace remarks that suggested themselves to him. "You are well, I hope. It's an age since I saw you." "I have been at Fontainebleau," she quietly replied. Rougon raised his eyes and gave her a searching glance. But in her turn she began to question him. "And are you well pleased?" she asked. "Is everything going on as you wish it?" "Yes, quite so," the minister replied. "Oh, so much the better." For a moment she turned around him with all the attention of a professional waiter. But her malicious flashing eyes were fixed on him, as though she were every moment going to overwhelm him with her triumph. At last, as she was making up her mind to leave him, she raised herself upon tiptoes and cast a glance into the adjoining hall. And thereupon she touched Rougon's shoulder. "There is someone looking for you, I believe," she said, with an animated expression on her face. Merle, indeed, was respectfully threading his way between the neighboring chairs and tables. He made 3 bows, one after the other, and begged His Excellency to excuse him. But, said he, the letter which His Excellency had been expecting all the morning had arrived, and although he had received no instructions, he'd thought— Yes, all right. Give it to me," interrupted Rougon. The usher handed him a large envelope and then went off to prowl about the bazaar. Rougon had recognized the writing at a glance. It was an autograph letter from the Emperor in answer to the one preferring his resignation. A chilly perspiration mounted to his brow. Still, he showed no sign of pallor, but quietly slipped the letter into an inner pocket of his coat, without ceasing to meet the glances that were directed upon him from Monsieur Khan's table. Clorinde had just gone to speak a few words to the latter gentleman, and the whole band was now watching Rougon with feverish curiosity. However, Clorinde returned and again stood in front of him while he drank half his glassful of sugared water, and thought of some compliment to address to her. "You're looking quite lovely today, if queens turn themselves into waiting maids." But she cut his compliment short. "You haven't read your letter, then?" she said audaciously. For a moment he affected forgetfulness, and then all at once pretended to recollect. "Oh yes, that letter. I'll read it at once, if it will give you any pleasure." He opened the envelope carefully with a penknife, and at a glance read the brief letter inside it. The Emperor accepted his resignation. For nearly a minute he kept the letter before his face, as though he were reading it over again. He felt afraid lest he should not be able to maintain a calm expression. A terrible protest was rising within him, a rebellion of his whole strength, which was unwilling to accept this downfall, shook him to his very bones. If he had not sternly restrained himself, he would have shouted aloud and have smashed the table with his ponderous fists. And with his eyes still fixed upon the letter, he pictured the Emperor as he had seen him at St. Cloud, renewing his expressions of confidence and confirming his previous instructions with soft words and ceaseless smile. What long-devised plan of disgrace had Napoleon been maturing behind that impenetrable expression of his, that he should now so suddenly have crushed him in a night, after a score of times insisting on his retaining office? At last, by a mighty effort, Rougon conquered his emotion. He raised his face again, and it appeared unruffled. Then he put the letter back into his pocket with a careless gesture. But Clorinde, whose hands rested upon the little table, stooped eagerly towards him, and with quivering, eager lips exclaimed, "I knew it all. I was there this morning, my poor friend." Then she went on to pity him in so cruelly mocking a voice that he again looked keenly at her. She had ceased to dissemble now. She had at last reached the triumph to which she had been looking forward for months past, and she spoke slowly and deliberately, savoring the sweetness of being at last able to show herself his implacable and avenged foe. "I was unable to defend you," she continued. "You are doubtless not aware." Then she broke off and said with a cutting expression, "Guess who succeeds you as Minister of the Interior?" He made a gesture expressive of indifference, but she still kept her eyes fixed on him, and at last let these words fall, "My husband." Rougon, whose mouth was parched, drank some more of the sugared water. Clorinde had thrown into her last two words the expression of all she felt, her anger at having been formerly despised, the rancor which she had so skillfully satisfied, her delight as a woman in having crushed a man who was credited with the highest abilities. And she allowed herself the pleasure of torturing him and abusing her victory. No doubt, said she, her husband wasn't a very clever person. She confessed it freely, and even joked about it, meaning to convey that the first comer would have done equally as well, and that she could have made Merle a minister if the whim had seized her. Yes, indeed, the usher Merle, or any other imbecile that she might have come across. Any one would have done to succeed Rougon. All this went to prove the omnipotence of woman. Then she assumed a motherly, protecting air and began to lavish good advice. You see, my friend, as I've often told you, you made a mistake in despising women. Women are not the fools you imagine them to be. It used to make me quite angry to hear you speak of us as though we were idiots, mere cumbersome paraphernalia, even millstones about your neck. Look at my husband now. Have I been a millstone to him, do you think? I've been looking forward to show you all this. I promised myself this satisfaction, as you may perhaps remember, on the day when we had a certain conversation together. Now I hope I have convinced you. I willingly allow, my friend, that you are a very clever fellow, but be quite sure of this, that a woman can always topple you over if she chooses to take the trouble." Rougon had turned rather pale. Still he smiled. "Yes, I dare say you are right," he said in a low voice, calling to mind all that had gone before. He indulged in no recriminations. Clorinde had sucked some of his strength away from him to use it for his own overthrow. She had applied to his own ruin the lessons which she had learnt from him during those pleasant afternoons in the Rue Marbeuf. He was now drinking the cup of ingratitude and treason, but, man of experience that he was, he accepted it with all its bitterness. The only point which troubled him was whether he even now fully understood Clorinde. He thought of his former inquiries about her, his futile efforts to discover the secret workings of that majestic but erratic machine. Decidedly, he said to himself, the folly of man was great indeed. Clorinde had twice left him for a moment to serve other customers, and now that she had had full satisfaction, she again resumed her stately perambulations amidst the tables, affecting to take no further notice of him. He watched her, however, and saw her approach a gentleman with an immense beard, a foreigner, whose lavish prodigality was at that time quite exciting Paris. He was just finishing a glass of Malaga. "How much, madame?" he inquired, rising from his seat. 5 francs, monsieur. Everything is 5 francs a glass." He paid the money. "And a kiss. How much is that?" he continued, in the same tone with his foreign accent. 100,000 francs, answered Clorinde, without the slightest hesitation. The foreigner sat down again and wrote a few words on a page which he tore from a memorandum book. Then he deposited a smacking kiss on Clorinde's cheek, paid for it, and went off in the most phlegmatic manner possible. All the people in the café smiled, much amused by the incident. "It's only a question of paying the price," murmured Clorinde, going up towards Rougon again. He detected a fresh allusion in this remark. To him she had said never. And then this man of chaste life, who'd borne so bravely the stunning blow of his dismissal, began to feel keenly pained by the collar which Clorinde so impudently paraded. She stooped and swayed her neck, as though to provoke him still further. The pearl tinkled in the golden bell. The chain hung low, still warm from the hands of the giver, and on the velvet flashed the diamond letters by which Rougon could easily read the secret known to everybody. And never before had he so keenly felt the bite of unconfessed jealousy, the burning envy which he had sometimes experienced in the presence of the all-powerful emperor. The young woman probably guessed the torment he was suffering, and it pleased her to inflict yet another pang upon him. She called his attention to Madame de Combelot, who was still selling her roses in the flower stall. "Ah, that poor Madame de Combelot," she said with a malicious laugh. "She is still waiting." However, Rougon finished his sugared water. He felt as though he were choking. "How much?" he stammered, taking out his purse. 5 francs. This ends Chapter 13, Part 2. Chapter 13, Part 3 of His Excellency Eugene Rougon by Émile Zola, translated by Ernest Alfred Visitelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 13, Part 3. When she tossed the coin into the bag, Clorinde held out her hand again. "Aren't you going to give anything to the waiter?" she asked playfully. Rougon felt in his pocket and brought out a couple of sous, which he dropped into her hand. This insult was the only vengeance which his parvenu boorishness could think of. In spite of her self-possession, Clorinde blushed, but she quickly resumed her goddess-like demeanor and went off bowing and saying, "Thank you, Your Excellency." Rougon did not dare to rise immediately. His legs felt nerveless. He was afraid of tottering and desired to go away as he had come, with a firm gait and calm expression. He particularly disliked having to pass his old friends and associates, whose straining ears and staring eyes had not lost the point of what had taken place. So, for a few moments longer, he let his glance wander over the room, feigning perfect indifference. He was thinking over what had happened. Another act of his political life had come to a conclusion. He had fallen, undermined, eaten away, and ruined by his band. His heavy shoulders had collapsed beneath the weight of the responsibilities he had assumed, the acts of folly and injustice which he had perpetrated entirely on their account, in his braggart craving to be a feared and generous chief. And his mighty muscles only made his fall the more ignominious. The very conditions on which he had held power, the necessity of having behind him a crowd of greedy appetites whose longings he must satisfy, of maintaining himself in his position by dint of abusing his credit, had made his fall merely a question of time. And he now recalled the slow efforts of his band, whose sharp teeth had day by day nibbled away some of his authority. They had thronged around him, hung onto his knees, then onto his breast, then onto his throat, and finally they had choked him. They had availed themselves of him in every way. They had used his feet to climb with, his hands to plunder with, his jaws to devour with. They had, so to say, used his body as their own, used it for their personal gratification, indulging in every fancy without a thought of the morrow. And now, having drained his body, and hearing its framework crack, they abandoned him like rats, whom instinct warns of the approaching collapse of a house, the foundations of which they have undermined. They were all sleek and flourishing, and they were already battening upon someone else. M. Kahn had just sold his railway line from New York to Angers to M. de Marcy. In another week, the colonel would be gazetted to an appointment in the imperial palaces. M. Bouchard had received a formal promise that his protégé, the interesting Georges Duchesne, should be appointed assistant head clerk as soon as Delestang entered upon his duties at the Ministry of the Interior. Madame Caron was rejoicing over a serious illness which had fallen on Madame Martineau, and already pictured herself residing in her house at Coulanges, where she would live comfortably and play the part of a Lady Bountiful. M. Bejoin, on his side, was certain of the Emperor visiting his cut-glass works towards the autumn, and lastly, M. d'Escorhaille, after being seriously lectured by his parents, was rendering homage to Clorinde and winning a sub-prefecture merely by the look of admiration with which he watched her carrying glasses about the refreshment room. And Rougon, as he glanced at his glutted band, felt as though he had grown smaller, whereas they had attained to huge proportions and were crushing him beneath their weight. And he did not dare to rise from his seat, for fear lest he should see them smile if he happened to totter. By degrees, however, he grew more collected, and then he at last stood up, and he was pushing the little zinc table aside to give himself room to pass, when Delestang entered the refreshment room on Count de Marcy's arm. There was a very curious story in circulation about the latter. If certain whisperings were to be believed, he had gone to Fontainebleau the previous week, while Clorinde was there, solely to facilitate the young woman's assignations with the Emperor, by entertaining and amusing the Empress so as to divert her attention. To most people this seemed merely a piquant incident, but Rougon fancied he could detect in it a piece of revenge on the part of the Count, who had leagued himself with Clorinde to bring about his fall, thus turning against him the very weapons which had been successfully employed against himself some time previously at Compiègne. At all events, the Count, since his return from Fontainebleau, had kept perpetually in Delestang's company. Monsieur Kahn, Monsieur Bejoin, the Colonel, indeed the whole coterie, received the new minister with open arms. His appointment would not be officially notified in the Moniteur till the following morning, when it would appear beneath the announcement of Rougon's resignation. But the decree was signed, and so they were at liberty to triumph. They greeted him with much vigorous handshaking, grinning, and whispered congratulation. Indeed, the presence of the crowd alone kept their enthusiasm within bounds. It was a gradual assumption of possession on the part of intimates, who kiss one's hand and one's feet before making one's entire body their prey. They already considered that Delestang belonged to them. One of them was holding him by the right arm, another by the left. A third had grasped one of the buttons of his coat, while a fourth, standing behind him, craned forward and breathed words of praise to the nape of his neck. Delestang, on his side, held his handsome head erect with affable dignity, preserving the stately yet imbecile demeanor of some monarch on his travels, such as one sees in official prints, receiving bouquets from the ladies of petty towns. Rougon looked at the group, very pale and stung to the quick by this triumph of mediocrity, and yet he could not restrain a smile. He remembered. "I always predicted that Delestang would go a long way," he said with a subtle expression to Count de Mercy, who had stepped up to him with outstretched hand. The Count replied by a slight pout, instinct with delicate irony. He had doubtless had much amusement since he'd struck up a friendship with Delestang after rendering certain services to his wife. He detained Rougon for a moment, evincing the most refined politeness. Constant rivals as they were, antagonists by reason of their very temperaments, these two skillful men saluted each other at the termination of each of their duels, like enemies of equal strength who looked forward to an endless succession of return combats. Rougon had previously wounded Mercy. Mercy had now wounded Rougon, and so it would go on until one or other of them should be left dead on the field. It is possible that neither would have cared to see the other absolutely ruined, for their rivalry was at once a source of amusement and occupation, and moreover they vaguely felt that they were counterpoises necessary for the equilibrium of the empire. One, the shaggy fist which killed by a knockdown blow, the other, the slender gloved hand which clutched the throat and strangled. However, Delestang was a prey to painful embarrassment. He had seen Rougon, but he did not know whether he ought to step up and shake hands with him. In his perplexity, he glanced at Clorinde, who seemed absorbed in her duties and indifferent to everything else. She was now hurrying about the room with sandwiches and pastry. However, her husband thought he could gather instruction from a glance she cast at him, so he at last advanced towards Rougon, nervous and seeking to justify himself. "I hope, my dear friend, that you don't bear me any ill will," he said. "I refused at first, but they forced me to accept. There are demands, you know." But Rougon interrupted him. The Emperor had acted in his wisdom, and the country would find itself in excellent hands. At this Delestang took courage. "I said all I could in your defense," he continued. "We all did. But really, between ourselves, you had gone a little too far. The greatest grievance against you was what you did in connection with the Charbonnel affair, the matter of those poor sisters, you know." Monsieur de Marcy restrained a smile. "Oh, yes, the perquisition at the convent," replied Rougon, with all the good humour of his successful days. "Well, really, among the various acts of folly which my friends led me to commit, that was perhaps the only sensible and just act of my 5 months of power." He was already going off when he noticed Dupoissac come in and seize hold of Delestan. The prefect pretended not to see him. For the last 3 days he'd been hiding in Paris and waiting, and apparently he was now successful in his request to be transferred to another prefecture, for he began to express the most profuse thanks with a wolfish smile which revealed his irregular white teeth. Then, on the new minister turning round, Merle, whom Madame Carreur had just pushed forward, almost fell into his arms. The usher kept his eyes lowered, like a big bashful girl, while Madame Carreur spoke warmly in his favor. "He is not a favorite in the office," she murmured, "because he protested by his silence against abuses of authority, and he saw some very strange ones under Monsieur Rougon." Yes, very strange ones indeed," added Merle. "I could tell a long story about them. Monsieur Rougon won't be much regretted. I've no reason to love him myself. It was all through him that I was nearly turned adrift." Rougon heard none of this. He was already slowly passing down the great hall, where the stalls were now quite denuded of their wares. To please the Empress, who was the patroness of the charity, the visitors had carried everything away, and the delighted stall-holders were talking of opening again in the evening with a fresh supply of goods. They counted up the money they had taken, and different sums were shouted out amidst peals of triumphant laughter. One lady had taken 3,000 francs, another 7,000, and another 10,000. The last was radiant with delight at having made so much money. Madame de Combelot, however, was in despair. She had just disposed of her last rose, and yet customers were still thronging round her kiosk. She stepped out of it to ask Madame Bouchard if she could not give her something to sell, no matter what. But the latter's lucky wheel had likewise disposed of everything. A lady had just carried off the last prize, a doll's washing basin. However, they obstinately hunted about, and at last found a bundle of toothpicks which had fallen on the ground. Madame de Combelot carried it off with a shout of triumph. Madame Bouchard followed her, and they both mounted into the kiosk. "Gentlemen, gentlemen!" cried Madame de Combelot boldly, standing up and collecting the men together with a beckoning sweep of her bare arm. "This is all that we have left, a bundle of toothpicks. There are 25 of them. I shall put them up to auction." The men jostled one another, laughing and waving their gloved hands in the air. Madame de Combelot's idea was hailed with great enthusiasm. "A toothpick," she now cried. "We'll start it at 5 francs. Now, gentlemen, 5 francs. 10 francs, said a voice. 12 francs. 15 francs. However, on Monsieur d'Escurails suddenly going up to a bid of 25 francs, Madame Bouchard quickly called out in her fluty voice, "Sold for 25 francs." The other toothpicks fetched still higher prices. Monsieur La Roquette paid 43 francs for the one that was knocked down to him. Chevalier Rusconi, who had just made his appearance, bid as much as 72 francs for another one. And eventually the very last, a very small one, which was split, as Madame Combelot kindly announced, not wishing to impose upon her audience, was knocked down for 117 francs to an old gentleman whose eyes glistened at the sight of the young woman's heaving bosom, as she vigorously plied the calling of auctioneer. "It is split, gentlemen, but it is still a serviceable article. We've got 108 francs for it. 110 are bid over there. 111, 112, 113, 114. Come, 114. It's worth more than that, gentlemen. 117. 117. Won't anyone bid any more? Sold, then, for 117 francs. Pursued by these figures, Rougon left the hall. He slackened his steps when he reached the terrace overlooking the river. Stormy-looking clouds were rising in the distance. Below him the Seine, greasy and dirty green, flowed sluggishly past the pale quays, along which the dust was sweeping. In the Tuileries gardens, puffs of hot air shook the trees, whose branches fell languidly, lifelessly, without a quiver of their leaves. Rougon took his way beneath the tall chestnuts. It was almost quite dark there, and the atmosphere was damp and clammy like that of a vault. As he emerged into the main avenue, he saw the Charbonnels sitting on a bench. They were quite transformed, magnificent. The husband wore light-colored trousers and a frock coat fitting tightly at the waist, while his wife sported a light mantle over a robe of lilac silk, and her bonnet was ornamented with red flowers. Astride one end of the bench, however, there was a ragged, shirtless fellow wearing a wretched old shooting jacket. He was gesticulating energetically, and gradually drawing near to the Charbonnels. It was Gilles Quint. Administering frequent slaps to his canvas cap, which kept on slipping off his head, he exclaimed, "They're a parcel of scoundrels. Has Theodore ever tried to cheat anyone out of a single copper? They invented a fine story about a military substitute in order to ruin me. Then, of course, as you can understand, I left them to get on as they could without me. Ah, they are afraid of me. They know very well what my political opinions are. I have never belonged to Berenguer's gang. I only regret one person down there," he continued in a low voice, leaning forward and rolling his eyes sentimentally. "Ah, such an adorable woman, a lady of society. She was fair. I had some of her hair given me." Then, edging himself up to Madame Charbonnel, he broke into a loud voice again and tapped her on the knee. "Well, old lady, when are you going to take me with you to Plassans to taste those preserves of yours? The apples and the cherries and the jam. You've got your nest pretty well lined now, eh?" But the Charbonnels seemed to be much annoyed by Gilles Quint's familiarity. "We are stopping in Paris for some time," replied Madame Charbonnel stiffly, while gathering up her lilac silk dress. "We shall probably spend 6 months here every year." "Ah, yes," added her husband with an air of profound admiration. "Paris is the only place." Then, as the gusts of wind became stronger, and a troop of nurses with children passed hastily through the garden, he resumed, turning to his wife, "We'd better be getting home, my dear, if we don't want to be soaked through. Fortunately, we've only a step or two to take." They were now staying at the Hôtel du Palais Royal in the Rue de Rivoli. Gilles Quint watched them go off, shrugging his shoulders contemptuously. "So they leave me in the lurch too," he muttered. "Ah, they're all alike." But then he suddenly caught sight of Rougon, and rising with a swagger, he waited for him to pass. "I haven't been to see you yet," he said, again tapping his cap. "I hope you're not offended. That mountebank du Poisson has told you some fine stories about me, I dare say. But they are all lies, my good fellow, as I can prove to you whenever you like. Well, for my part, I don't bear you any ill will, and I'll prove it by giving you my address. 25 Rue du Bon Puits at La Chapelle, 5 minutes' walk from the barrier. So if I can be of any further use to you, you see, you've merely to let me know." Then he walked away with a slouching gait. For a moment he glanced round as if taking his bearings, and then, shaking his fist at the Tuileries, which showed grey and gloomy beneath the black sky at the end of the avenue, he cried, "Long live the Republic!" Rougon passed out of the garden and went up the Champs-Élysées. He experienced a strong desire to go and look at his little house in the Rue Marbeuf. He intended to quit his official residence on the morrow, and again install himself in his old home. He felt tired, but calm, with just a slight pain in the depths of his being. He already dreamt hazily of some day proving his powers by again doing great things. Every now and then, too, he raised his head and looked at the sky. The rain did not seem inclined to come down just yet, though the horizon was streaked with coppery clouds, and loud claps of thunder traveled over the deserted avenue of the Champs-Élysées, with a crash like that of some detachment of artillery at full gallop. The crests of a tree shook with the reverberation. As Rougon turned the corner of the Rue Marbeuf, the first drops of rain began to fall. A brougham was standing in front of the house, and Rougon found his wife examining the rooms, measuring the windows and giving orders to an upholsterer. He felt much surprised, but she explained to him that she had just seen her brother, Monsieur Boulanger. The judge, who had already heard of Rougon's fall, had desired to overwhelm his sister, and after informing her of his approaching assumption of office as Minister of Justice, he had again tried to create discord between her and her husband. Madame Rougon, however, had merely ordered her brougham to be got ready so that she might at once prepare for removal into their old house. She still retained the calm, pale, nun-like face, the unchangeable serenity of a good housewife. And with faint step she went through the rooms, again taking possession of that house which she had endued with such cloistral quietude. Her only thought was to administer like a faithful stewardess the fortune which had been entrusted to her. Rougon felt quite touched at the sight of her spare, withered face, and all her scrupulous attention. However, the storm now burst with tremendous violence. The thunder pealed, and the rain came down in torrents. Rougon was obliged to remain there for nearly 3/4 of an hour, for he wanted to walk back. When he set out again, the Champs-Élysées was a mass of mud, yellow, liquid mud, which stretched from the Arc de Triomphe to the Place de la Concorde like the bed of a freshly drained river. In the avenue there were but few pedestrians, who carefully picked their way along the curbstones. The trees stood dripping in the calm, fresh air. Overhead in the heavens the storm had left a trail of ragged, coppery clouds, a low, murky veil from which fell a glimmer of weird, mournful light. Rougon had again lapsed into his dreams for the future. He felt stiff and bruised, as though he had come into violent collision with some obstacle that had blocked his progress. But suddenly he heard a loud noise behind him, the approach of galloping hoofs which made the ground tremble. He turned to see what it could be. It was a cortege dashing through the mire of the roadway beneath a faint glimmer of the coppery sky, a cortege returning from the Bois and illumining the dimness of the Champs-Élysées with the brilliance of uniforms. In front and behind galloped detachments of dragoons, and in the center there was a closed landau drawn by 4 horses and flanked by 2 mounted equerries in gorgeous gold-embroidered uniforms, each of which imperturbably enduring the splashing of the mire, which was covering them from their high boots to their cocked hats. And inside the dim closed carriage only a child was to be seen, the Prince Impérial, who gazed out of the window with his 10 fingers and his red nose pressed to the glass. "Hullo, it's the little chap," said a road sweeper with a smile, as he trundled his barrow along. Rougon had halted, looking thoughtful, and his eyes followed the cortege as it hurried away through the splashing puddles, speckling even the lower leaves of the trees with all the mire it raised. This ends Chapter 13, Part 3. Chapter 14, Part 1 of His Excellency Eugene Rougon by Émile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Visitelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 14, Part 1. Transformation. One day in March, 3 years later, there was a very stormy sitting in the Corps Legislatif. The privilege of presenting an address to the Crown had been conceded by the Emperor, and for the first time this address was being discussed. Monsieur La Rouquette and Monsieur de Lamberton, an old deputy and the husband of a charming wife, sat opposite one another in the buvette, or refreshment room, quietly drinking grog. "Well, shall we go back into the chamber?" said Lamberton, who'd been straining his ear to listen. "I fancy things are getting pretty warm there." Every now and then, indeed, one heard distant shouting, a sudden roar like some squall of wind. But afterwards complete silence ensued. Monsieur La Rouquette continued smoking with an air of utter indifference. "Oh, we needn't go just yet," he said. "I want to finish my cigar. They'll let us know if we are wanted. I told them to do so." La Rouquette and Lamberton were the only members then in the buvette, a sort of smart little café established at the end of a narrow garden at the corner of the quay and the Rue de Bourgogne. Painted a soft green, covered with bamboo trellis work, and having large windows that opened right onto the garden, the place looked like some conservatory transformed into a refreshment room for a garden party. It was panelled with mirrors. The tables and counter were of red marble, and the seats were upholstered with green rep. One of the windows was open, and through it there came the soft air of the lovely spring afternoon, freshened by the breezes from the Seine. "The Italian war filled the cup of his glory," said Monsieur La Rouquette, continuing a conversation had it been interrupted. "Today, in conferring liberty on the country, he displays all the greatness of his genius." He was speaking of the Emperor, and he went on to extol the provisions of the November decrees, (Footnote: the more direct participation of the great state bodies in the policy of the sovereign, and the creation of ministers without departments for the purpose of representing the government in the chambers. It was a return to constitutional government, he said, in all its most wholesome and desirable features. A new era, that of the liberal empire, was beginning. Then he knocked the ash from his cigar in a transport of enthusiasm. But Monsieur de Lamberton shook his head. "I am afraid the Emperor has gone rather too fast," he said. "It would have been better to have waited a little longer. There was no pressing hurry." "Oh, yes, I assure you there was. It was quite necessary to do something," replied the young deputy with animation. "It's just in that respect that his genius—" Then he lowered his voice, and with a profound expression began to explain the political situation. The charges issued by the bishops on the subject of the Pope's temporal power, which was threatened by the government of Turin, were greatly disturbing the Emperor. On the other hand, the opposition was growing more active, and an uneasy thrill was passing through the country. So the moment had come for making an attempt to reconcile the different parties and win political malcontents over by wise concessions. La Rouquette now considered that the despotic empire had been very defective, whereas the liberal empire would be a blaze of glory, illumining the whole of Europe. "Well, I'm still of opinion that he's gone too fast," repeated Monsieur de Lamberton, again shaking his head. "It's all very well to talk about the liberal empire, but the liberal empire is the unknown, my dear sir, the unknown. The unknown—" He thrice repeated this expression, each time in a different tone, and waving his hand in the air. Monsieur La Rouquette said nothing further. He was finishing his grog. However, they still sat where they were, gazing blankly out of the open window, as though they were looking for the unknown fate of the liberal empire across the quay, in the direction of the Tuileries, where hung a thick grey haze. Behind them, beyond the lobbies, the hurricane of voices rose afresh, with the uproar of an approaching storm. Monsieur de Lamberton turned his head uneasily. "It's Rougon who is going to reply, isn't it?" he asked after a pause. "Yes, I believe so," replied Monsieur La Rouquette, with an air of reserve. "He was very much compromised," the old deputy continued. The Emperor has made a singular choice in appointing him as a minister without department, and commissioning him to defend his new policy." Monsieur Larouquette did not immediately express an opinion, but slowly stroked his fair moustache. "The Emperor knows Rougon," he said at last. Then, in quite a different tone, he exclaimed, "I say, these grogs were not up to much. I'm dreadfully thirsty. I think I shall have a glass of syrup and water." He ordered one, and after some hesitation, Monsieur de Lamberton decided that he would have a glass of Madeira. Then they began to talk of Madame de Lamberton, and the old deputy chided his young colleague for the rarity of his visits. The latter was lounging back on the settee, furtively admiring himself in the mirrors, quite pleased by the soft green tint of the walls and the general freshness of the buvette, which seemed almost like a pompadour arbor reared in some princely forest for love assignations. However, an usher suddenly came in, almost breathless. "Monsieur Larouquette, you are wanted immediately." "Immediately," he gasped. Then, as the young deputy made a gesture of vexation, the usher stooped and whispered that he'd been sent by Monsieur de Marcy, the president of a chamber, himself. And he added in a louder tone, "Everybody is wanted, so come at once." Monsieur de Lamberton at once rushed off in the direction of the chamber, and Monsieur Larouquette was following him, when he appeared to change his mind. It had indeed occurred to him that it might be advisable to hunt up all the deputies lounging in different parts of the building and send them back to their places. So he hastened first into the conference hall, a beautiful apartment lighted by a glazed roof and boasting a huge chimney-piece of green marble, ornamented with 2 white marble female figures, nude and recumbent. Despite the warmth of the afternoon, a great wood fire was burning there. At the large table sat 3 deputies with sleepy eyes, which wandered over the pictures on the walls and the famous clock, which was only wound up once a year. A 4th deputy, who had installed himself at the fire so as to warm his back, seemed to be gazing with emotion at a plaster statuette of Henri IV, which at the other end of the room stood out against a trophy of Austrian and Prussian standards captured at Marengo, Austerlitz, and Jena. As Monsieur Larouquette went from one to the other of his colleagues, bidding them at once hurry to the chamber, they started up as if suddenly awakened, and hastened away in procession. In his enthusiasm, Larouquette was already rushing off to the library, when it occurred to him that it would be as well to glance into the lavatory. There he found Monsieur de Combalot, who, with his hands plunged in a large basin, was gently rubbing them and smiling admiringly at their whiteness. He did not show the least excitement, but said that he would return to his seat in a moment. Before doing so, however, he lingered for some time, wiping his hands on a warm towel, which he then replaced in the copper-doored stove. And finally he took a stand before a lofty mirror and carefully combed his handsome black beard. There was no one in the library, which Larouquette next visited. The books were slumbering on their oak shelves. The 2 huge tables with covers of green cloth stood severely bare, and the book rests attached to the arms of the chairs were folded back and covered with a light coating of dust. "There's never anyone here," exclaimed Larouquette in a loud voice, which sounded quite strange amid all the silence and solitude. And having closed the door with a bang, he went on searching a series of passages and halls. He crossed the distribution hall, floored with marble from the Pyrenees, where his footsteps echoed as though he'd been walking through a church. And an usher having told him that a deputy he knew, Monsieur de Villadière, was showing the palace to a lady and gentleman, he obstinately set about finding him. He hastened into the severe-looking vestibule known as General Foy's Hall, where the statues of Mirabeau, Foy, Bailly, and Casimir Perier invariably command the respectful admiration of country visitors. And nearby, in the throne-room, he at last discovered Monsieur de Villadière, with a fat lady on one side of him and a fat gentleman on the other, an influential elector and notary of Dijon, and his wife. "You're wanted," said Monsieur Larouquette. "Quick to your place, eh?" "Yes, I'll go at once," replied the deputy. But he could not make his escape. The fat gentleman had taken his hat off, much impressed by the magnificence of the hall, with its glittering gilding and mirrored panels, and he clung firmly to his dear deputy, as he called him, and would not let him go. He was asking for some explanations of Delacroix's paintings, the great decorative figures representing the seas and rivers of France. Mediterranean Mare, Oceanus, Ligeris, Rhenus, Sequana, Rhodanus, Garumna, Araris. These Latin words seemed to puzzle him. "Ligeris is the Loire," Monsieur de la Villardière explained. The Dijon notary briskly nodded his head to signify that he understood. Meanwhile his wife was examining the throne, an armchair slightly higher than the others, placed on a broad platform. She stood some little distance away from it, contemplating it with reverent emotion. Presently she summoned up sufficient courage to go nearer, and then, furtively raising its covering, she touched the gilded wood and felt the crimson velvet. However, Monsieur Larouquette was now scouring the right wing of the palace, with its interminable corridors and offices and committee rooms. He returned by way of the Hall of the Four Columns, where young deputies dream of fame while gazing at the statues of Brutus, Solon, and Lycurgus. Then he cut across the large waiting hall and hastily skirted a semicircular gallery, like a sort of low crypt, as dim and as bare as a church, and lighted day and night by gas. Finally, quite breathless, and dragging after him a little troop of deputies whom he'd gathered together, Larouquette threw open one of the mahogany doors decorated with gold stars. Monsieur de Combelot, his hands quite white, and his beard neatly combed, followed him. Monsieur de la Villardière, having made his escape from his constituents, came on close behind, and they all rushed together into the assembly hall, where the other deputies stood erect in their places, furiously shouting and waving their arms at a member in the tribune who seemed altogether unmoved by their cries. Footnote. "Order! Order! Order!" they shouted. "Order! Order!" cried Monsieur Larouquette and his friends, still louder than the others, though they knew absolutely nothing of what was going on. The uproar was frightful. Some deputies were ragefully stamping their feet, while others kept up a noise like that of a fusillade by violently rattling the lids of their desks. Screaming and yelping voices rose, fife-like, amidst others which were gruff and full, and rumbled on like an organ accompaniment. Every now and then there was a slight lull in the din, and then jeers could be distinguished in the subsiding clamor, and some words even were plainly heard. "It is detestable, intolerable. He must withdraw it. Yes, yes, withdraw it." However, the cry that was stubbornly repeated, which ever and ever went on to the rhythmical stamping of heels, was that of "Order! Order! Order!" coming hoarsely, huskily from 100 dry throats. The deputy in the tribune had crossed his arms, and was gazing calmly at his furious colleagues with barking faces and brandished arms. Twice, when the tumult seemed to subside, he attempted to continue his speech, but each time that he opened his mouth there came a renewal of the tempest, a fresh outburst of frantic rage. The din in the chamber was fairly ear-splitting. Monsieur de Marcy, erect in his place, with his hand upon the button of his bell, was ringing a continuous summons to silence amidst the hurricane. His long pale face remained perfectly calm. For a moment even he ceased to ring, quietly drew down his wristbands, and then applied himself to his bell again. A faint, skeptical smile, which was almost habitual to him, played round his thin lips, and whenever the shouters grew weary, he contented himself with repeating, "Gentlemen, allow me, allow me." At last he obtained comparative silence, and then he resumed, I call upon the member in the tribune to explain the words he's just made use of." Thereupon, the deputy in question, bending forward, with his hands resting on the edges of the tribune, repeated his words, emphasizing them by a determined movement of the chin. "I said that what took place on the 2nd of December was a crime." He was not allowed to proceed further. The storm broke out afresh. A deputy with flushed cheeks called him a murderer. Another applied such a filthy term to him that the shorthand writers smiled and refrained from reporting it. There was a crossfire of exclamations which mingled together. However, Monsieur Larouquette could be heard repeating in his shrill voice, "He is insulting the Emperor! He is insulting France!" Monsieur de Marcy made a dignified gesture and then sat down. "I call the speaker to order," he said. A long interval of agitation followed. This was no longer the drowsy corps législatif which 5 years previously had voted a credit of 400,000 francs for the Prince Impérial's baptism. On a bench to the left were 4 deputies who applauded the language which had been used by their colleague in the tribune. There were now 5 of them who attacked the empire. They were already shaking it by their continued efforts, refusing to recognize it or to vote for it, with an obstinate persistency which was destined to gradually rouse the whole country against it. These 5 deputies kept erect, tiny group though they were, amidst an overwhelming majority, and they replied to the threats and fists and clamorous browbeating of their colleagues without the least sign of discouragement, steadfast and fervent as they were in their desire for revenge. The very hall itself, echoing with all the feverish excitement, seemed to have been changed. The tribune beneath the president's desk had been set up again. The cold marbles and pompous columns round the amphitheater appeared to gather warmth from all the ardent oratory, while the light that streamed from the ceiling windows set the long tiers of crimson velvet seats ablaze amid the tempests of momentous debates. The massive presidential desk, with its severe panels, acquired life from the irony and impertinence of Monsieur de Marcy, who, with the slim figure of a worn-out man of pleasure, showed like a thin line against the bas-relief behind him. And only the symbolical statues of public order and liberty, in their niches between the pairs of columns, preserved inanimate countenances and pupilless, stony eyes. However, that which more than anything else imparted increased life to the hall was the much larger number of spectators, all excitedly leaning forward and eagerly following the discussions. The upper tier of seats had now been revived, and the newspaper reporters had a special gallery to themselves. High aloft, near the heavily gilded cornice, numbers of heads were craned forward, a swarming, invading throng, which occasionally made the uneasy deputies glance aloft, as though they fancied they could hear the rushing tramp of the populace on some day of insurrection. However, the member of the tribune was still waiting for an opportunity to continue. "Gentlemen, to resume my argument," he said, amidst the noise which still rolled on. Then he paused, and in a louder voice, which made itself heard above the tumult, he exclaimed, "If the chamber refuses to hear me, I shall leave the tribune with a protest." Go on, cried several deputies, and a thick, husky voice growled out the words, "Go on, we shall know how to answer you." Then, all at once, there was complete silence. From all the seats and galleries, deputies and spectators craned their heads forward to look at Rougon, who had just made this observation. He sat in the front row with his elbows resting on the marble tablet before him. His broad, bent back remained motionless, save when, now and then, he slightly swayed his shoulders. His face was buried in his hands and could not be seen. However, he was listening. His début was awaited with great curiosity, for he had not yet spoken since he had been appointed a minister without portfolio. He probably divined that many eyes were fixed on him, for at last he turned his head and glanced round the chamber. Opposite to him, in the minister's gallery, sat Clorinde in a violet dress, with her elbows resting on the red velvet balustrade. She gazed at him with her wonted tranquil boldness. For a moment their eyes met, but they exchanged no smile of recognition. It was as though they had been perfect strangers. Then Rougon reverted to his previous position, burying his face in his hands and again listening to the opposition deputy. "Gentlemen," said the latter, "I resume my argument. The liberties conceded by the decree of the 24th of November are perfectly illusory. We're still far away from the principles of '89, which are so ostentatiously inscribed at the head of the imperial constitution. If the government persists in arming itself with exceptional laws, if it continues to force its own candidates upon the country, if it refuses to free the press from arbitrary control, if, in a word, it still keeps France at its mercy, all the seeming concessions which it may make will be lying ones." At this the president intervened. "I cannot permit the speaker to use such a term," he said. "Hear, hear!" cried the deputies on the right. The deputy in the tribune took up his phrase again and softened it. He now strove to be more temperate in his language, speaking in carefully rounded periods of great purity of style, which fell from his lips with a solemn rhythm. But M. de Marcy angrily objected to almost every expression he used. And then the deputy launched out into abstract oratory, vague sentences overlaid with long words, which so veiled his real thoughts that the president was obliged to leave him alone. However, all at once the orator returned to his old manner. "To resume what I was saying, my friends and myself refused to vote the first paragraph of the address in answer to the speech from the throne. 'We can get on very well without you,' cried a voice, at which loud laughter sped along the benches. 'We shall not vote in favor of the first paragraph of the address,' quietly continued the representative of the opposition, 'unless our amendment is adopted. We cannot join in returning exaggerated thanks to the chief of the state when so many restrictions are imposed. Liberty is indivisible. It cannot be cut into fragments and distributed in rations like alms.' At this, fresh shouts arose from every part of the chamber. 'Your liberty is license! Don't talk about alms! You yourself are begging an unwholesome popularity. You'll be cutting off heads if you had your way.' 'Our amendment,' continued the deputy in the tribune, as though he heard nothing of these cries, 'asks for the repeal of the Public Safety Act, for liberty of the press, freedom of elections.' Here there was another outbreak of laughter. One member exclaimed, loud enough to be heard by his neighbors, 'Ah, fine fellow, you'll get nothing of all that.' And another made mocking comments on every sentence that dropped from the speaker's lips. The greater number, however, by way of amusing themselves, punctuated their colleagues' sentences by stealthily rapping their paper knives on their desks, thus producing a rattling sound, something like a roll of kettle drums, which quite drowned the speaker's voice. Nevertheless, he struggled on to the end. Drawing himself up, he thundered forth his concluding words in such wise as to be heard above all the uproar. 'Yes, we are revolutionists, if by revolutionists you mean men of progress, resolved upon winning liberty. Refuse the people liberty, and one day the people will seize it.' Then he descended from the tribune amidst a fresh outburst. The deputies were no longer laughing like a lot of schoolboys. They'd risen to their feet, turning towards the left, and again shouting, 'Order! Order!' The member of the opposition, who had regained his place, remained standing among his friends. There was a deal of surging, and the majority seemed inclined to throw themselves on those 5 men who stood there so defiantly with pale faces. M. de Marcy, however, angrily rang his bell, glancing as he did so at the gallery, where several ladies were drawing back, with an appearance of alarm. "Gentlemen," he said, "it is scandalous." And then, silence being restored, he continued in a loud and keenly authoritative voice. "I do not wish to call the honorable member a second time to order. I will content myself with saying that it is disgraceful in the extreme to proffer from this tribune menaces which dishonor it." Footnote. A triple burst of applause greeted these words from the president. The members of the majority cried, "Bravo!" and again rattled their paper knives, but this time in approbation. The opposition deputy wanted to say something in reply, but his friends restrained him. Then the tumult gradually subsided, till there only remained a buzz of private conversation. This ends Chapter 14, Part 1. Chapter 14, Part 2 of His Excellency Eugene Rougon by Émile Zola, translated by Ernest Alfred Visitelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 14, Part 2. "I now call upon His Excellency Monsieur Rougon," resumed Monsieur de Mercy in a quiet tone. A thrill, a sigh of satisfaction, as it were, ran through the chamber, followed by earnest attention. With slouching gait, Rougon had ponderously made his way into the tribune. He did not at first turn his eyes upon his audience, but laid a bundle of notes in front of him, pushed the glass of sugared water out of his way, and stretched his hands over the narrow mahogany table, as though he were taking possession of it. Then, at last, leaning against the president's desk behind him, he raised his face. He did not seem to grow any older. His square brow, his large, well-shaped nose, and his long cheeks, on which not a wrinkle showed, still had a pale rosy tint, the fresh complexion of some country notary. It was only his thick hair that had undergone any change. It had begun to grizzle and grow thinner about his temples, exposing his big ears. With eyes half closed, he glanced round the chamber, as if looking for someone. Then his glance encountered the attentive face of Clorinde, who was leaning forward, and he began to speak in a heavy, laborious way. "We, too, are revolutionists, if by that term is meant men of progress who are resolved to restore to the country, piece by piece, every reasonable liberty." Hear, hear! What government, gentlemen, has ever surpassed the empire in according a generous measure of liberal reform, such as the alluring program you have heard sketched out? It's not necessary that I should refute the speech of the honorable member who has just spoken. It will be sufficient to prove to you that the emperor, with his genius and noble heart, has forestalled the demands of the most bitter opponents of his rule. Yes, gentlemen, of his own accord, our sovereign has restored to the nation the power with which it entrusted him during a period of public danger, a magnificent spectacle of which there are few parallels in history. Oh, we can easily understand the discomfiture experienced by certain lawless individuals. They are reduced to attack our intentions, to carp at the measure of liberty which has been restored. But you have fully understood and appreciated, gentlemen, the great act of the 24th of November. In the first paragraph of the address, it has been your desire to express to the Emperor your deep gratitude for his magnanimity and his confidence in the discretion of the Corps Legislatif. To adopt the amendment which has been proposed to you would be a gratuitous insult, I will even say an act of baseness. Consult your own consciences, gentlemen, and ask yourselves whether you do not feel that you are free. Liberty has been granted whole and entire. That I formally guarantee." A prolonged outburst of applause here interrupted him. he had gradually drawn to the edge of a tribune, and now, bending forward with his right arm outstretched, he raised his voice, which rang out with wonderful power. Behind him, Monsieur de Marcy sat back listening and smiling vaguely, like a connoisseur admiring some brilliant tour de force. And amidst the loud cheering of the chamber, deputies kept bending forward, whispering or looking surprised with lips compressed. Clorinde's arms rested listlessly on the crimson velvet balustrade, but she seemed very serious. Rougon continued. "Today," he said, "the hour for which we were also impatiently waiting has at length struck. There is no longer any danger in making prosperous France free France also. The anarchical passions are dead. The energy of the sovereign and the solemn determination of the people have forever annihilated all abominable epochs of public perversity. Liberty became possible on the day when the faction which had so obstinately ignored the fundamental bases of sound government was defeated. And for this reason, the Emperor has deemed fit to lay aside the stern, strong hand, to decline excessive prerogatives as a useless burden, rightly considering his rule to be so unassailable that discussion may be freely allowed. And he has not shunned promises for the future. He will carry out his task of enfranchisement to the end, giving back one liberty after another at such times as shall seem fitting to his wisdom. Henceforth, it is a program of continual progress that it will be our duty to support in this assembly." "You, yourself, were the minister of the fiercest oppression," interrupted one of the 5 deputies on the left, indignantly rising from his seat. And another passionately added, "The purveyors for Cayenne and Lambessa have no right to speak in the name of liberty." An outburst of murmurs followed. Several deputies, who did not quite catch what was said, bent forward and questioned their neighbors. Monsieur de Marcy pretended not to have heard, and contented himself with threatening to call all interrupters to order. "I have been reproached," Rougon resumed. But shouts now rose from the right and prevented him from continuing. No, don't reply. Such insults are unworthy of your notice." Rougon pacified the chamber by a gesture, and with his big fists resting on the edge of a tribune, he turned to the left with the expression of a wild boar at bay. "I will not reply," he calmly said. What had gone before was merely the exordium of his speech. Although he had stated that he did not intend to refute the assertions of a deputy of the left, he now entered upon a minute discussion. He began by clearly stating the whole of his opponent's arguments, enumerating them with an air of fairness and candor which had an immense effect, for it was as though he disdained these arguments and could destroy them by a breath. However, as he went on, he appeared to forget them entirely, and without replying to any of them, he attacked the weakest with indescribable violence and quite overwhelmed it beneath a flood of words. Applause burst forth. He triumphed. His whole body seemed to fill the tribune. His shoulders swayed in rhythm with his periods. His oratory was of a mediocre, inartistic order, bristling with legal points and trite commonplaces, which he bellowed forth in thundering tones. He shouted and brandished trivialities, and his only real oratorical gift was his immense, inexhaustible fund of breath, which enabled him to pour forth magniloquent sentences for hours together, careless of what they might contain. After he'd spoken for an hour without a break, he gulped down a mouthful of water and panted a little while rearranging his notes in front of him. "Take a rest," cried several deputies. But he did not feel at all tired and wanted to finish. "What is it, gentlemen, that is asked of you?" he resumed. "Hush! Hush!" Every face was now again fixed on him with silent, straining attention. At certain bursts of his oratory, the chamber quivered from one end to the other, as though a gale had swept through it. "What is asked of you, gentlemen, is that you should repeal the Public Safety Act." I will not now recall the ever accursed hour which made that act a needful weapon. It was necessary to reassure the country, to save France from a fresh cataclysm. Today the weapon is sheathed. The government, which invariably used it with the greatest prudence, I will even say with the greatest moderation. Quite true. The government now only uses it in certain altogether exceptional cases. It inconveniences no one except those sectaries who still cherish the guilty madness of wishing for the return of the basest days of our history. Search through our towns, search through our villages. Everywhere you will find peace and prosperity. Inquire of all orderly citizens, and you will not find one who feels in any way oppressed by those exceptional laws which are imputed to us as great crimes. I repeat that, in the paternal hands of the government, they simply continue to shield society against all hateful attempts, the success of which, moreover, is henceforth impossible. Honest, well-disposed men have no occasion to trouble themselves about their existence. Leave them to their slumber until our sovereign shall feel justified in doing away with them himself. But what else is asked of you, gentlemen? Freedom of elections, the liberty of the press, every kind of liberty that can be imagined. Let me pause for a moment to glance at the great things which the empire has already accomplished. All around me, wherever I turn my eyes, I see public liberties increasing and bearing splendid fruits. I feel the profoundest emotion. France, once fallen so low, is now fast recovering and giving to the world the example of a nation winning its own freedom by its good behavior. The days of trial are now over. There's no longer any question of a dictatorship or of despotism. We are all workers in the cause of liberty. Bravo! Bravo! Freedom of elections is asked for, but is not universal suffrage on the widest basis the primordial source of the empire's existence? Doubtless the government recommends its candidates, but does not the Revolutionary Party support its own with shameless audacity? We are attacked, and we defend ourselves. Nothing could be fairer. Our opponents would like to gag us, bind us hand and foot, reduce us to the condition of dead bodies. That is the thing which we can never allow. Our love for our country requires that we should advise it and tell it where its true interests lie. It still remains the absolute master of its destinies. It votes, and we bow to its wishes. Those members of the opposition who belong to this assembly, where they enjoy entire liberty of speech, are themselves a proof of our respect for the decrees of universal suffrage. The Revolutionary Party must settle the matter with the nation, for it is the nation that supports the empire by overwhelming majorities. In Parliament, all obstacles to free control have now been swept aside. Our sovereign has been pleased to accord the great bodies of the state a more direct participation in his policy, and a conspicuous proof of his confidence in them. Henceforth, you will be able to discuss the measures of the government. You will be able to exercise the right of amendment in the fullest degree, as well as to express all your desires. Every year the discussion on the address will form, as it were, an interview between the emperor and the representatives of the nation, at which the latter will be able to say whatever they please with perfect freedom. It is by free and open discussion that powerful states are formed. The tribune is restored to you, the tribune which so many orators, whose names history has preserved, has made illustrious. A parliament which discusses is a parliament that works. And to tell you the real truth, I am glad to see here a group of opposition deputies. There will always be amongst us opponents who will try to find us at fault, and who, by doing so, will make our good faith show conspicuously. We solicit the most generous treatment for them. We fear neither passion nor scandal, nor abuse of the freedom of speech, dangerous though these things be. As for the press, gentlemen, under no government determined upon making itself respected has it enjoyed greater freedom than it does at present. Every great question and every serious interest has its organs. The government only opposes the propagation of dangerous doctrines, the dissemination of poisonous ideas. For the honorable portion of the press, which is the great voice of public opinion, I assure you that we entertain the most absolute respect. It assists us in our task. It is the tool of the age. If the government has taken it into its own hands, this is only to keep it from falling into those of its enemies. Approving laughter arose. Rougon was now drawing near to his peroration. He gripped the framework of the tribune with the stiffened fingers of his left hand, and throwing his whole body forward, he swept the air with his right arm. His words flowed forth like a sonorous torrent. And suddenly, amidst his glowing praise of a new liberal policy, he seemed overcome by wild excitement. He shot his fist forward like a battering ram, as though aiming at something yonder in empty space. This invisible enemy was the specter of the Red Revolution. In a few dramatic sentences, he depicted that red specter shaking its blood-stained banner and waving its incendiary torch as it rushed on, leaving streams of mud and gore behind it. His voice rang out like the alarm bell of the days of revolution, while bullets whizzed by and the Bank of France was sacked and the money of respectable citizens was stolen and shared. The deputies turned pale in their seats as they listened. But then Rougon calmed down and concluded by speaking of the emperor in warm bursts of laudation, which suggested the swaying of a censer. "God be thanked," said he. "We are under the protection of the prince whom Providence in its infinite mercy selected to save us. We can safely rest beneath the shelter of his wisdom. He's taken us by the hand and is leading us step by step through the breakers to the safety of the harbor." Footnote. Vociferous applause resounded. For nearly 10 minutes the proceedings were interrupted. A crowd of deputies rushed to meet the minister as he returned to his seat, with perspiration streaming down his face and his figure still quivering from such an expenditure of breath. Monsieur La Roquette, Monsieur de Combelot, and 100 others poured forth their congratulations and stretched out their arms to try and grasp his hand as he passed them. The whole chamber was heaving with excitement. Even the occupants of the gallery shouted and gesticulated. Beneath the sunlit ceiling window, amidst the gilding and the marble, all the severe magnificence characteristic both of a temple and an office, there raged commotion such as one might find in a public square on some day of demonstration. Bursts of doubting laughter, loud exclamations of astonishment and of wild admiration. All the clamor, in a word, of a passion-swayed multitude. And as the eyes of Monsieur de Marcy and Clorinde met, they both nodded their heads in confession of the great man's triumph. The speech which Rougon had just delivered was his first step up that splendid ladder of fortune which was to carry him to so great a height. However, a deputy had mounted the tribune. He had a clean-shaven face, a waxy complexion, and long yellow hair, with sparse curls which fell over his shoulders. Standing stiff and rigid, he consulted some big sheets of paper, the manuscript of a speech, which he finally commenced to read in an unctuous voice. "Silence, gentlemen! Silence!" cried the usher. This deputy had certain explanations to ask from the government. He showed great irritation at the dilatory attitude of France in presence of the threats of Italy against the Holy See. The temporal power of the Pope, said he, was really the ark of God, and the address ought to contain a formally expressed hope, a command even, that this power should be maintained in all its integrity. The speaker launched out into historical references and showed that the forces of Christianity had established political order in Europe many centuries before the treaties of 1815. Then, in periods that breathed fear and consternation, He said that he beheld with the greatest alarm the olden society of Europe vanishing in the midst of popular convulsions. Every now and then, as he indulged in too direct an allusion to the King of Italy, murmurs sped through a part of the chamber. But the compact group of clerical deputies on the right, nearly 100 strong, listened most attentively, accentuating his slightest references by an expression of approval, applauding too every time that he named the Pope with a slight reverent inclination of the head. A chorus of bravos greeted his last words. "It distresses me," he said, "that proud Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, should become the obscure vassal of Turin." Rougon, though his neck was still wet with perspiration, his voice hoarse and his big frame exhausted by his previous exertions, insisted upon replying at once. It was a remarkable sight. He made a parade of his fatigue, exhibited it ostentatiously, dragging himself to the tribune, where he began by stammering faint words. He bitterly complained that men of position, hitherto so loyal to the imperial institutions, should now be among the adversaries of the government. There must surely be some misunderstanding. They could not wish to swell the ranks of the revolutionists and weaken the power which made constant efforts to ensure the triumph of religion. And turning towards the deputies on the right, he addressed them with pathetic gestures, spoke to them with a humility full of craft, as though they were powerful foes, the only foes that he really feared. Meantime, his voice gradually recovered all its previous force, and once more he filled the chamber with a bellowing roar, striking his breast the while with his closed fist. "We are accused of irreligion," he cried. "It is a falsehood. We are the reverent children of the Church, and it is our happiness to be faithful believers. Yes, gentlemen, faith is our guide and our support in this task of governing, which is often so heavy a burden. What indeed would become of us if we did not trustfully place ourselves in the hands of Providence? Our only pretension is to be the humble executants of its designs, the docile instruments of the will of God. It is this which enables us to speak out freely and to accomplish some little good. And gentlemen, I am happy that this opportunity presents itself for me to bend the knee with all the fervor of a true Catholic heart before the sovereign pontiff, before that august and venerable old man, whose watchful and devoted daughter France will ever remain." Before he had well finished, the chamber resounded with applause. His triumph was becoming an apotheosis. The very walls shook. When they were all leaving, Clorinde watched for Rougon to pass by. He and she had not exchanged a word for the last 3 years. When he made his appearance, looking younger and lighter, having in a single hour given the lie to all his previous political life, ready to satisfy, under the fiction of constitutionalism, his rageful craving for power, she yielded to an impulsive feeling and stepped towards him, with hand outstretched and moist, caressing eyes. "Ah," said she, "in spite of everything, you are a wonderfully able fellow." The end. This ends chapter 14, part 2. This concludes His Excellency Eugene Rougon by Émile Zola, translated by Ernest Alfred Visitelli. Section 37 of His Excellency Eugene Rougon by Émile Zola. Notes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Footnote 1, 16,000 louis. Footnote 2. This is a reference to the Peace of Paris after the Crimean War. Editor. Footnote 3. Marny, it will be remembered, was the illegitimate son of Queen Hortense, the Emperor Napoleon's mother. Editor. Footnote 4. Charles X, the exiled king, was then living there. Editor. Footnote 5. The idea of this clothier's advertisement, La redingote russe, was derived from the circumstance that Napoleon I wore a grey overcoat like the one depicted during his last campaigns. Editor. Footnote 6. 1,000 francs equals 40 pounds. Footnote 7. Napoleon I. Footnote 8. An allusion to Monsieur Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Editor. Footnote 9. This was the duel between Saint Arnaud and Cornemuse, in which the latter was killed. Both had been accused of stealing 4,000 louis in notes off the emperor's table, but the real culprit was probably King Jerome, Napoleon's uncle. Editor. Footnote 10. There was a similar instrument, like a cottage piano in shape but with a handle at the side, in the Empress's private rooms at the Tuileries, and at Her Majesty's Monday receptions, Prince Richard Metternich, the Austrian ambassador, would grind it by the hour, just like some professional of the streets. Mérimée fell out for a time with Chevalier Nigrat, Victor Emmanuel's representative, because he suggested one afternoon that the latter should relieve the prince, maliciously adding that organ grinding was essentially an Italian art. Editor. Footnote 11. 1,000,000 sterling per annum for himself, 400,000 louis for the Empress Eugénie, and 200,000 louis for the Prince Impérial. Editor. Footnote 12. The narrative which follows above is virtually matter of history. Only for Gilles Quint's name one should substitute that of a detective officer who carried his information to Monsieur Claude, afterwards famous as the chief of the French detective police. Editor. Footnote 13. Felice Orsini. Footnote 14. A favorite nickname for Napoleon III, properly the name of the workman whose clothes he donned when escaping from the fort of Ham. Editor. Footnote 15. The opera house then stood there. Editor. Footnote 16. The Commission de Colportage, by which at that period all books dealing with politics or social economy had to be licensed before being hawked about. The object of this regulation was to prevent the circulation of all literature in any way hostile to the imperial policy or the organization of the empire. Editor. Footnote 17. The functions of the Minister of State, an office which no longer exists, and which might therefore puzzle even the reader acquainted with French affairs, comprised the following matters: the intercourse of the Crown with the Senate, the Corps Legislatif, and the Council of State, the sovereign's official correspondence with the various ministries, the duty of countersigning all decrees, appointing ministers, senators, and state councillors, the supervision of the Imperial Opera House, the Théâtre Français, the Odéon Theatre, the Institute, the Salon, the public libraries, etc., was also within the attributions of the Ministry of State until June 1863, when a decree instituted the Ministry of Fine Arts as an adjunct to that of the imperial household. Editor. Footnote 18. This was the favorite device of the imperial government. Even money voted for the army was diverted to other purposes, and France paid the penalty in 1870. Editor. Footnote 19. That of retailing books and pamphlets by peddlers. Footnote 20. When Napoleon III was a lad, his mother, Queen Hortense, as her letters show, was wont to call him mon doux en tête, virtually, my gentle but stubborn boy. Editor. Footnote 21. November 24 and 27, 1860. These decrees gave the right of presenting an address, promised the legislature full explanations on questions of home and foreign policy, and made certain provisions to enable the deputies to present amendments to government bills. Editor. Footnote 22. Jules Favre. Editor. Footnote 23. an allusion to the coup d'etat of December 2, 1851. Editor. Footnote 24. Jules Favre, Ernest Picard, Hénon of Lyon, Émile Olivier, and Alfred d'Arimont. Unhappily, the two last subsequently sold themselves to the Empire. Editor. Footnote 25. A second call to order would have carried with it expulsion and suspension for 5 days, according to the rules then in force. Editor. Footnote 26. Sedan. Editor. This ends the notes for His Excellency Eugene Rougon.